The Anunnaki were not born in a modern conspiracy book. They were already ancient when Babylon was young. In the oldest cities of Mesopotamia, scribes wrote of beings who ruled from the heavens, judged beneath the earth, shaped kingship, assigned destiny, and stood near the beginning of human existence itself. They were called the Anunnaki. To some, they were gods. To others, symbols of cosmic law. And to modern imaginations, they became something far stranger, possible visitors from beyond the stars. But before we turn them into aliens, we have to ask a quieter question. What did the ancient texts actually say? Because the real story does not begin with spacecraft, lost planets, or secret laboratories hidden beneath the sands. It begins with mud brick cities beside the rivers, with temple towers rising above crowded streets, with priests watching the sky, and scribes pressing wedge-shaped signs into clay before the memory of most civilizations had even begun. This is where the Anunnaki first appear, not as a single, simple answer, but as a shifting presence in myths, hymns, rituals, royal ideology, and stories about creation and death. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Tonight, we are not chasing the loudest version of the legend. We are following the older trail, through Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria, through flood stories older than the Bible, through divine courts, underworld judges, heavenly kingship, and the uneasy idea that humanity may have imagined itself, from the beginning, as living under powers it could never fully understand. The mystery of the Anunnaki is not simply whether they came from the sky. It is why the first cities on Earth looked upward and believed someone was looking back. Long before anyone argued about lost planets or ancient astronauts, the Anunnaki belonged to a much older world, a world of river mud, harvest anxiety, temple accounts, and kings who needed the favor of powers greater than themselves. That world was Mesopotamia. The name means between rivers, and it refers to the lands shaped by the Tigris and Euphrates, where some of the earliest cities in human history rose from the plain. These were not cities in the modern sense, with clean borders and predictable systems. They were fragile experiments. Walls had to be maintained. Irrigation canals had to be cleared. Grain had to be counted, stored, distributed, protected. A failed flood or a broken canal could become a political crisis, a famine, a divine warning, sometimes all three at once. In that setting, religion was not a private feeling tucked away from public life. It was the operating system of the city. A temple was not simply a place where people prayed. It was a household for a god. It owned land. It received offerings. It organized labor. It stored wealth. It stood at the center of a city's identity because the city did not imagine itself as belonging merely to its human population. It belonged, in a profound sense, to the deity who watched over it. To understand the Anunnaki, we have to begin there, not with a landing site, with a temple. In Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria, divine beings were not distant decorations in the sky. They were woven into law, kingship, weather, fertility, warfare, writing, illness, dreams, and death. A good harvest could be read as favor. A plague could be read as anger. A military victory could become proof that a ruler had been chosen. A defeat might suggest that the gods had withdrawn their protection. which is a terrifying idea when your king's authority depends on heaven agreeing with him. This is one reason modern readers often misunderstand Mesopotamian religion. We tend to imagine mythology as a collection of stories, colorful, symbolic, perhaps poetic, but separate from the serious machinery of life. For the people of ancient Mesopotamia, myth was not a bedtime category. It explained why the world had structure. It explained why kings ruled, why humans worked, why cities mattered, and why the universe seemed to behave like a vast court, full of ranks, commands, decrees, punishments, and negotiations. The gods had personalities, but they also had offices. They were not only characters, they were powers. The Anunnaki emerge from this dense religious world. They appear in different kinds of texts, and that matters. A god who appears in a hymn is being praised. A god who appears in a myth is acting inside a sacred story. A god who appears in a ritual text may be invoked for a very specific purpose. A god named in a royal inscription might be used to support the authority of a king. These sources do not all do the same job, so we have to be careful when we gather them under one dramatic label. That caution is important, because the Anunnaki did not begin as a modern mystery brand. They were part of a living religious vocabulary that changed over centuries. In the earliest Sumerian settings, the divine world was crowded and layered. There were great gods associated with heaven: storms, fresh water, fertility, love, war, the underworld, writing, and the sun. There were city gods, protective spirits, divine servants, terrifying demons, and lesser beings whose roles shifted depending on place and period. The Anunnaki belonged within this larger population of the sacred. They were not always presented as a neat team with a fixed membership list, like a council in a fantasy novel. Ancient religion was messier than that. And more interesting. A name could stretch. A title could move. A group of gods could be emphasized differently in one city than in another. Over time, as languages changed and empires rose, older Sumerian ideas were adapted into Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian traditions. Myths were copied, edited, reinterpreted, and preserved by scribes who were themselves living many generations after some of the stories had first taken shape. This is one of the quiet miracles of Mesopotamian history. So much of it survived because people wrote on clay. Clay is humble. It cracks. It breaks. It does not look noble in the way marble does. But when fired by accident or preserved in dry earth, it can outlast kingdoms. A palace burns, and the tablets inside may harden. A library falls, and fragments remain. Later, archaeologists lift those broken tablets from the ground and find not just accounts of grain and sheep, but arguments between gods, laments for ruined cities, hymns to divine power, and stories about the beginning of the human condition. The Anunnaki come to us through that broken archive, not through a single secret manuscript, not through one forbidden tablet that explains everything, through fragments, copies, variations, and contexts. That is less convenient than a conspiracy theory, but it is much closer to how ancient history actually works. The oldest cities did not leave us a clean documentary record. They left us a damaged conversation. We listened through missing lines, uncertain translations, repeated formulas, and the habits of scribes trained in traditions older than themselves. And yet, even through the damage, something powerful can be heard. Mesopotamian civilization imagined the universe as governed, not random, not empty. Governed. The heavens were not merely above, they were administrative. The earth was not merely beneath. It was assigned, measured, cultivated, claimed. Even the underworld had judges. That vision feels strange to us because we often separate politics, religion, nature, and astronomy into different rooms of thought. Mesopotamia did not divide the world so neatly. A city could be a sacred estate. A king could be a human agent of divine order. A star could be a sign. A flood could be a decision made somewhere beyond human reach. And this is where the first real mystery begins to sharpen. The Anunnaki were not invented to answer our modern questions about aliens, technology, or secret origins. They answered older questions, perhaps more frightening ones. Who controls the forces that make cities possible? Why must human beings labor? Why do rulers have power over others? Why does death have a court? Why does the sky seem to speak in patterns? The people who asked these questions were not primitive in the lazy sense of the word. They were building cities, tracking time, recording transactions, composing literature, and imagining the cosmos with a seriousness that still unsettles us. Their gods were not simple explanations for things they did not understand. They were part of a grand attempt to make reality intelligible, socially, politically, spiritually. That does not mean we should take every myth literally. It means we should take the myth-makers seriously, because once we do, the Anunnaki stop looking like a puzzle piece ripped from its original board and dropped into a modern theory. They return to the cities that gave them meaning: Uruk, Nippur, Eridu, Babylon, Assur, and many others whose names still carry the weight of beginnings. There, among temple economies and royal rituals, beneath skies watched by trained observers, beside rivers that could nourish or destroy, the Anunnaki were not outsiders to civilization. They were among the powers civilization used to explain itself. And before we can ask who they were, we have to ask what their name even meant. The word Anunnaki sounds to modern ears like a proper name carved from a single block. It feels specific, almost branded. But in the ancient texts, the term is more slippery than that. It moves. It changes weight depending on where it appears, when it appears, and which tradition is using it. And that matters, because many modern theories begin by treating the Anunnaki as if ancient Mesopotamians meant one fixed race of beings, with a single origin story, a single mission, and a single hidden agenda. The texts do not make it that simple. The name is usually connected to Anu, the great sky god, a distant, elevated figure whose authority hovers above much of Mesopotamian divine order. In broad terms, Anunnaki has often been understood as something like those of Anu or offspring of Anu, though the exact meaning and development of the word are not as tidy as a documentary narrator might wish. Ancient languages rarely behave like museum labels. Words gather old meanings, lose them, absorb local traditions, and survive long enough to become slightly unfamiliar even to later scribes. So when we ask what the Anunnaki really means, we are not opening a locked box. We are entering a history of usage. In some contexts, the Anunnaki appear as great gods, high-ranking divine powers associated with authority, fate, and the cosmic order. In others, especially in later traditions, they can be linked more strongly with the underworld, appearing as judges or powers beneath the earth. Sometimes they seem close to the highest divine assembly. Sometimes the term overlaps with other divine groupings, and the borders are not always clean. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. Because the ancient world did not preserve the Anunnaki for us in the form of a handbook. There is no surviving Mesopotamian document titled Everything You Need to Know About the Anunnaki with diagrams, which is inconsiderate, frankly, but typical of history. What we have instead are references scattered across genres and centuries, embedded in religious language that was alive, flexible, and deeply local. This is where a careful reading begins to separate itself from a hungry one. A hungry reading grabs the most dramatic word, isolates it, and builds a tower on top of it. It says, "Here is a mysterious name, therefore it must conceal a mysterious race." A careful reading asks where the word appears, what function it serves, and whether the same term meant the same thing in every period. Often, it did not. Mesopotamian religion was not a single frozen system. Sumerian traditions influenced Akkadian ones. Babylonian theology reworked older materials. Assyrian power gave certain gods new political importance. Scribal schools copied ancient compositions while living in worlds very different from the ones that first produced them. Across that long history, a divine name or group title could carry inherited prestige while shifting in emphasis. Think of it less like a scientific classification and more like a royal title passed through centuries of changing courts. The title remains recognizable. The office changes around it. This is one reason the Anunnaki can feel so confusing. They belong to a divine society that had hierarchy, but not always the kind of hierarchy modern readers expect. We want a chart. We want names in boxes, arrows between them, a clean list of members and responsibilities. Ancient Mesopotamian theology gives us something more like a crowded palace. Senior gods, local gods, divine messengers, underworld powers, scribal traditions, borrowed names, rival cult centers, and old stories that continue to echo long after their original political setting has changed. Inside that palace, the Anunnaki are important, but not always in one identical way. At times, they seem to represent the weight of divine authority itself, those solemn powers who confirm destinies and belong near the machinery of cosmic rule. At other times, their presence is darker, more chthonic, more connected to judgment after death. In myths of descent to the underworld, this second face becomes especially vivid. But it would be a mistake to take that one role and force it backward onto every appearance of the name. This is how ancient material gets distorted, not always by invention, sometimes by overconfidence. A term is found in one dramatic passage, and suddenly every use of it is forced to mean the same thing. A divine title is translated in a way that sounds strange, and suddenly strangeness becomes evidence. A myth uses the language of heaven, and heaven becomes outer space. A god is associated with the sky, and the sky becomes a planet. Step by step, metaphor is treated as machinery. The ancient texts deserve more patience than that. The connection to Anu is still important. Anu, as a sky god, represents a level of authority that is remote, elevated, and difficult to approach. He is not always the most active character in the stories, but his position matters. In many religious systems, the highest power is not necessarily the busiest. The distant sovereign may command more awe precisely because he does not need to appear in every scene. That distance gives the Anunnaki part of their atmosphere. They are not household spirits of minor inconvenience. They are not little gods who misplace your sandals or make the goats nervous. They are tied to the grand architecture of existence: heaven, earth, the underworld, kingship, fate, creation, judgment. Even when the term shifts, it tends to carry a sense of rank. These are not casual beings, but rank is not the same thing as extraterrestrial identity. This distinction sounds obvious, yet it is the crack through which a great deal of modern speculation enters. The ancient world spoke of gods who came from heaven. Modern readers here came from the sky and imagine descent through physical space. The ancient world spoke of divine authority above the human realm. Modern readers imagine advanced beings from another planet. The ancient world placed gods among stars and planets as signs and presences. Modern readers may turn those associations into coordinates. The leap is tempting because it gives myth a hard surface. It lets us convert poetry into technology. But the older meaning may be stranger than technology. For Mesopotamians, heaven was not merely a location. It was a level of reality. It was authority, order, distance, brightness, pattern, command. To say a power belonged to heaven did not require engines. It required a universe in which meaning descended from above. And when the Anunnaki are connected to Anu, that is the world we are entering. A world where the sky was not empty. A world where the divine assembly could determine the fates of cities. A world where human life was imagined as dependent on decisions made in realms human beings could not see, challenge, or fully understand. This is also why the name survived so well in the modern imagination. Anunnaki has a sound that invites mystery. It is ancient, unfamiliar, and slightly severe. It does not carry the softer familiarity of Greek or Roman gods, whose names have been worn down by centuries of paintings, planets, brand names, and schoolbook retellings. The Anunnaki still feel like they come from somewhere older and less domesticated. And in a way, they do. They come from some of the earliest written mythologies we possess. They come from civilizations that looked at the pressures of urban life: labor, drought, kingship, death, debt, war, fertility, and time, and imagined those pressures as part of a divine order. The Anunnaki are one expression of that order. Their name points us toward Anu, but their meaning spreads across the wider system of Mesopotamian thought. So perhaps the better question is not simply, what does the word translate to? The better question is, what kind of universe needed such a word? Because a civilization does not invent a category of great divine powers for decoration. It does so because it feels the world is layered. It senses that visible events have invisible backing. A king sits on a throne, but kingship itself must come from somewhere. A human body dies, but judgment may continue somewhere below. A city rises from mud, but its destiny may be written in a higher court. The Anunnaki gave language to that architecture. They helped name the powers behind the visible world. And once we understand that, the next figures come into sharper view. Anu, distant in heaven. Enlil, commanding and storm-like. Enki, wise, watery, and dangerously clever. Not merely gods in isolation, but forces in a divine politics that shaped the Mesopotamian imagination for thousands of years. At the center of the Mesopotamian divine world, there was no single throne that explains everything. There were ranks, rivalries, inherited powers, local traditions, and a kind of sacred politics that could feel surprisingly human, not because the gods were small, but because humans understood authority through the world they knew. Courts, councils, commands, alliances, offices. The universe, in this imagination, did not run on abstract laws alone. It ran on decisions. And above those decisions stood Anu. Anu is often described as the god of heaven, but that simple phrase can be misleading if we hear it too quickly. Heaven. Here is not a fluffy afterlife floating somewhere above the clouds. It is height, distance, legitimacy, the uppermost authority. Anu does not always dominate the stories through action. He is not the restless hero charging into every myth with thunder in his hands. His power is quieter than that, and in some ways more intimidating. He is the kind of authority that does not need to speak often to matter. In Mesopotamian religion, a distant god could still be central, maybe especially central. The highest office is not always the busiest office. A king may sit far from a canal worker, yet the canal worker still lives in a world shaped by the king's decrees. In a similar way, Anu's distance did not make him irrelevant. It made him elevated. His name carried the weight of the sky itself, and the Anunnaki, with their connection to him, inherited part of that sense of high divine rank. But a universe cannot be governed only by distance. Someone has to command. That role often belongs to Enlil. Enlil is one of the most powerful and imposing figures in the Mesopotamian pantheon. He is associated with authority, kingship, command, and the force that moves through the world like wind or storm. If Anu represents the high sanction of heaven, Enlil feels closer to the machinery of rule. He is the voice that orders, the power that assigns, the force before which kings and cities must lower their heads. There is a severity to Enlil, not cartoon evil, not villainy. Something more ancient and less comfortable, the severity of rule itself. In the Mesopotamian imagination, order was precious because chaos was never far away. A river could destroy a field. A drought could empty a city. An enemy could breach a wall. Disease could move through houses without asking permission. To maintain order was not a gentle task. It required boundaries, hierarchy, labor, obedience, and punishment. Enlil embodies some of that hard logic. He is not merely a weather god in the narrow sense. He is the divine force of command in a world where command could mean survival. That is why stories involving him can feel morally tense to modern readers. We often want gods to be either comforting or obviously monstrous. Mesopotamian gods refuse that convenience. Enlil's authority could uphold civilization, but it could also threaten humanity when human noise, disorder, or excess disturbed the divine balance. In flood traditions, for example, divine anger is not presented as a simple mustache-twirling scheme. It emerges from a cosmos where the gods have interests, preferences, limits, and conflicts. Humanity is not standing in a neutral universe. Humanity is living inside someone else's order. Then there is Enki, also known in Akkadian as Ea, and the tone changes. Enki is one of the most fascinating figures in ancient Mesopotamian religion because he does not fit neatly into the category of stern ruler. He is wise, subtle, creative, and often difficult to pin down. He is associated with fresh water, especially the deep subterranean waters imagined beneath the earth, and with knowledge, craft, magic, and creation. If Enlil commands, Enki understands. If Enlil represents decree, Enki represents intelligence moving around the decree. That difference matters. In myths where humanity is created or preserved, Enki often appears as the god whose cleverness makes continuation possible. He is not simply kind in the modern sentimental sense, though he can seem sympathetic to human beings. His wisdom is more complicated. He knows how systems work. He knows where the loopholes are. He can operate inside divine politics with a tactician's patience and a magician's smile. If there is a God in this world who makes you lean forward and listen more carefully, it is Enki. Because he suggests that power is not only the ability to command, power is also the ability to interpret, to advise, to shape events without always appearing to overturn them. This triad, Anu, Enlil, and Enki, gives us a way to understand why the Anunnaki belong to something much richer than a simple list of ancient beings. These gods form part of the backbone of Mesopotamian divine politics. One represents the distant authority of heaven. One represents command, kingship, and the dangerous necessity of order. One represents hidden wisdom, water, creation, and the arts of survival. Together, they create a cosmos that feels governed, but not simple. And this is where the stories become psychologically interesting. Ancient Mesopotamians lived in a world where survival depended on cooperation with forces larger than the individual. The city required labor. The fields required water. The ruler required legitimacy. The household required protection. The dead required rights. The future required omens. In such a world, the gods did not merely explain thunder or sunshine. They explained pressure. They gave sacred shape to the experience of being governed by powers you could not ignore. Anu was the height above you. Enlil was the command over you. Enki was the hidden depth beneath you. That vertical structure is important. Heaven above, earth in the middle, deep waters below, underworld further beneath. The Mesopotamian cosmos was not an empty stage. It was layered with agencies. Human beings lived in the narrow band, where decisions from above and forces from below met in daily life. A farmer clearing a canal, a king receiving a crown, a scribe copying a myth, a mourner making offerings for the dead. All of them moved within a universe imagined as thick with authority. This is also why later attempts to turn these gods into a single extraterrestrial command crew flatten the material. The ancient stories are not less strange because they are religious. They are strange in a different way. They present existence as political all the way down. Nature has administration. Fate has procedure. Death has judges. Creation has labor disputes. Even wisdom has jurisdiction. That may sound almost bureaucratic, but bureaucracy was one of civilization's great inventions. Someone had to count grain. Someone had to assign workers. Someone had to decide which fields received water first. Someone had to record debts, offerings, rations, and boundaries. Once humans built cities, they learned that survival required management. Then they looked at the cosmos and imagined a divine version of the same truth. The gods, in other words, were not only magnified humans, they were magnified institutions. And the Anunnaki belonged to that institutional imagination. They were powers of rank, judgment, destiny, and cosmic order. Their world was not a loose collection of magical episodes. It had structure. It had offices. It had a terrifying sense that every life, from king to laborer, existed within a system older and greater than itself. There is something unsettling about that. Modern people often imagine freedom as the absence of visible control. But ancient Mesopotamian myths suggest a different anxiety, that the universe might be controlled, but not necessarily for our comfort. The gods may have plans. They may have disagreements. They may create humans for reasons humans would not have chosen. They may grant kingship, then withdraw favor. They may hear prayers, or they may remain distant. They may preserve life, but still demand service. That tension runs through the Anunnaki tradition. It is not simply awe, it is dependence. To live beneath these gods was to live inside a sacred hierarchy where power flowed downward, obligations flowed upward, and human beings occupied a fragile middle place. The great gods were not decorative figures in the background of ancient life. They were the deep logic behind why society existed as it did. And perhaps that is the most revealing part. When Mesopotamians imagined divine authority, they did not imagine a universe of perfect serenity. They imagined councils, commands, disputes, judgments, and negotiations. Their gods had grandeur, but also politics. Their cosmos had order, but not always mercy. Their myths preserve not only belief, but the emotional texture of early civilization. Gratitude for structure, fear of power, suspicion of authority, and the hope that somewhere in the system, wisdom might still intervene. Anu gives the order height. Enlil gives it force. Enki gives it depth. And around them, the Anunnaki begin to look less like isolated, mysterious beings and more like members of a vast divine administration, a heavenly and underworld order through which Mesopotamia imagined reality itself being governed. Imagine a universe run less like a battlefield and more like an office with no closing hours. That may sound unromantic, but it brings us closer to the Mesopotamian imagination than many grander phrases do. The divine world was not simply a crowd of powerful beings doing impressive things. It had order, rank, procedure, responsibilities, a sense that every important feature of existence had been assigned, authorized, and placed under supervision. The gods did not merely exist, they administered. For people living in the first great city cultures, this idea would not have felt absurd. A city is a miracle only when seen from far away. Up close, it is a negotiation with chaos. Water must arrive at the right time, in the right channels, and not in the wrong streets. Grain must be harvested, counted, stored, and guarded. Labor must be organized. Disputes must be judged. Temples must receive offerings. The king must appear legitimate, not simply strong. The calendar must align with ritual, agriculture, and the movements of the sky. Civilization was management under pressure. So when Mesopotamians looked beyond the city, they did not imagine a universe of empty space and indifferent matter. They imagined a greater city, a cosmic state, where divine powers held offices over nature, fate, kingship, death, fertility, storms, wisdom, writing, and the deep waters beneath the earth. The world worked because someone, somewhere, had authority over its functions. The Anunnaki belonged to this governed cosmos. This is one of the most important details to understand, because it changes the atmosphere of the entire mystery. The Anunnaki were not random supernatural visitors wandering through myths like strangers in bright costumes. They appear within a structured, divine hierarchy, part of a world where authority was layered from heaven down to earth and below. Their power was not merely physical, it was legal, sacred, cosmic. They could be associated with the assigning of destinies, and destiny, in Mesopotamian thought, was not a vague mood. It was closer to a decree, something pronounced, something fixed by higher powers. The future, at least in the sacred imagination, could be determined in council, written into order, and enforced through the machinery of the universe. That idea can feel heavy. It means human life was not imagined as floating freely through a neutral world. It was placed inside decisions made elsewhere. A king's reign, a city's fortune, a person's lifespan, the success of fields, the stability of society. All of it could be understood as connected to divine determination. The gods did not simply watch events unfold, they gave events their authorized shape. This helps explain why kingship mattered so much. A Mesopotamian king could not rule by muscle alone. He needed sacred backing. He needed to be seen as part of the divine order, not an accident of ambition. The gods granted kingship, confirmed it, removed it, transferred it, or allowed disaster to reveal that legitimacy had been lost. In that world, politics was never only politics. It was theology with an army and a tax system. This does not mean every ruler was naively believed by everyone at all times. Ancient people were perfectly capable of recognizing violence, propaganda, weakness, and failure. But the language of divine approval gave power a deeper foundation. It turned rule into something more than domination. It made kingship appear woven into the structure of the cosmos. That was useful for kings. It was also dangerous for them. Because if power came from the gods, then failure could be read as divine rejection. A bad harvest, a military loss, an omen in the sky, unrest in the city. These could become more than unfortunate events. They could become signs that the sacred order had shifted. The throne stood high, but not securely. It depended on forces above it. In this sense, the divine bureaucracy did not only justify power, it restrained it, haunted it, and made it answerable to invisible courts. The temple city gives us the earthly reflection of this system. Each city had its divine patron, its rituals, its sacred duties, its economic life tied to the temple estate. Offerings were not merely symbolic gestures. They were part of a relationship between humans and gods, a maintenance of order. Food, drink, incense, textiles, music, labor, prayer, all of these helped sustain the bond between the city and its divine household. To modern ears, feeding a statue may sound strange, but within the ancient system, the cult image was not treated as a mere object. It was the visible seat of divine presence, cared for with the seriousness one might give to a royal body. Washing, clothing, presenting meals, performing rituals, these acts were not superstition in the shallow sense. They were service within a sacred administration. Humans worked for the gods. The gods, in return, upheld the world humans depended on. This exchange was not always warm. It was not a friendship between equals. It was more like dependence within a hierarchy. That is why Mesopotamian religion can feel both intimate and intimidating. The gods had houses in the city, yet their decisions could be remote. They received offerings from human hands, yet their counsels could determine the fate of nations. They were near enough to be served, but too high to be controlled. The Anunnaki, as great divine powers, belonged to the upper reaches of this arrangement. They represented not merely personality, but institution. Their presence suggests that the universe had a chain of authority, and that human society mirrored it because human society was thought to participate in it. Here we find a detail often missed in modern retellings. The divine hierarchy was not just an explanation of the cosmos, it was a model for civilization. The ordered universe and the ordered city reflected each other. The gods had ranks, humans had ranks. The gods held councils, kings held courts. The gods issued decrees, rulers made laws. The gods received service, temples organized labor. The cosmic imagination gave sacred depth to social order. It made hierarchy feel not merely convenient, but natural, even eternal. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because myths do not only reveal what people believed, they reveal what a society needed belief to do. A world of canals, taxes, labor gangs, scribes, priests, and kings required a powerful story about why order mattered and why obedience had meaning. The divine bureaucracy supplied that story. It said that human organization was not just human invention. It echoed the structure of reality itself, but the same idea also carried anxiety. If the universe is bureaucratic, then the individual may be small inside it. A name in a ledger, a laborer assigned a task, a petitioner waiting outside a court, a mortal whose fate is decided in a council one cannot attend. That is one reason the Anunnaki feel so formidable. They are not frightening only because they are ancient gods. They are frightening because they belong to a vision of reality in which judgment, assignment, and decree are built into the fabric of existence. They stand for a cosmos where power is organized and where humans survive by serving the order that contains them. Yet there is a strange dignity in this too. The Mesopotamians did not imagine themselves as living in a meaningless void. Their universe was demanding, but it was not empty. It could be read, appealed to, served, negotiated with through ritual, prayer, omen interpretation, and proper conduct. Even fear had a structure. Even uncertainty had offices, for a farmer watching the water level rise, for a scribe copying an omen, for a king standing before a god's image. This mattered. The world might be dangerous, but danger was not entirely shapeless. Behind it were powers with names, ranks, duties, stories. This is perhaps the deepest reason the Anunnaki endured. They gave form to the invisible pressure of existence. They explained why life felt ruled by forces beyond the human hand. Weather, death, authority, hunger, fertility, time. They placed those forces inside a divine administration that could be honored, feared, and occasionally persuaded. Not controlled exactly, but approached. And that is very different from the modern fantasy of aliens with superior machines. Machines may impress us, but bureaucracy governs us. The ancient imagination understood that with unnerving clarity. The Anunnaki belonged to a universe where the ultimate mystery was not simply what the gods could do, but how power itself was arranged. Who commands? Who records? Who judges? Who grants the crown? Who decides when a city rises and when it falls? Who writes destiny into the bones of the world? For Mesopotamia, these were not abstract philosophical games. They were questions of survival. And once a civilization imagines heaven as a court, it is only a short descent to imagine the underworld as one, too. A darker court beneath the living earth, where the Anunnaki appear not as distant powers of cosmic rank, but as judges before whom even the dead must stand. The descent begins with a woman preparing to leave the world of the living. Not an ordinary woman. Inanna, Queen of Heaven, Goddess of love, war, desire, splendor, and terrifying self-possession. She is one of the most vivid divine figures in Mesopotamian literature, and in the myth of her descent, the bright architecture of the heavens gives way to something lower, older, and far less forgiving. The underworld is not presented as a place of moral reward or punishment in the later religious sense. It is not a shining paradise for the good and a flaming prison for the wicked. It is more severe than that, because it is more final. It is the great below, the house from which no one expects to return. A realm of diminished existence, ruled not by hope, but by order. And order here has judges. Inanna's descent is one of the places where the Anunnaki take on their darker aspect. They are not standing at the top of the cosmic structure now, not only linked with high divine authority or the assigning of destinies. They appear as powers of the underworld, seated in judgment, part of a court beneath the earth. The same ancient imagination that pictured heaven as governed also pictured death as governed. Even the end of life did not mean escape from administration. That is a chilling thought. In the story, Inanna approaches the realm of her sister, Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. The myth is strange, formal, and ritualized. Inanna does not simply fall into darkness. She passes through gates. At each gate, something is taken from her: crown, ornaments, garments, signs of status and power. Piece by piece, the goddess is stripped of the symbols that made her recognizable in the upper world. This is not just drama. It is theology in motion. The descent says something brutally clear. The underworld does not honor the decorations of life. Rank may matter in the heavens, in the city, in the palace, in the temple. But at the threshold of death, the visible signs of power are removed. The goddess who enters below cannot carry the full costume of above. She must be reduced before judgment can occur. That image has survived because it speaks beyond its own culture. Every society dresses power in symbols: crowns, robes, titles, seals, uniforms, names carved into buildings. The Mesopotamians knew this very well. Their world was full of sacred objects and visible ranks. But the myth of Inanna's descent imagines a place where those signs are taken away, one gate at a time, until even a goddess stands exposed before a deeper law. Then come the judges. The Anunnaki of the underworld are not loud in the way modern horror might make them. They do not need to be. Their terror comes from stillness, from authority, from the fact that they belong where no living person wants to go. They look upon Inanna, and their judgment is deadly. The goddess is struck down, turned into a corpse, hung like something emptied of divine brightness. It is an astonishing image, the radiant goddess of life and power rendered powerless in the land of the dead. But again, the story is not just trying to shock, it is exploring the limits of power. Inanna can cross boundaries. She can command attention. She can descend where she should not. But the underworld has its own sovereignty. It is not merely a basement under heaven. It is a kingdom with laws, rulers, gates, and judges. Even divine force must answer to the order of that realm. This is where the Anunnaki become especially important. Their role as underworld judges reveals a different face of the Mesopotamian cosmos. The same civilization that built temples to gods of the sky and city also imagined a hidden court beneath human feet. Death was not chaos. It was not disappearance into nothing. It was entry into another jurisdiction. That word may feel too modern, but the idea fits. A jurisdiction is a region where a certain authority applies. The living city has its laws. The temple has its rituals. The palace has its commands. Heaven has its decrees. And the underworld has its judges. The Anunnaki, in this setting, are guardians of that boundary between life and death, enforcing the seriousness of a realm that even gods cannot treat lightly. There is no need to turn this into alien machinery to make it unsettling. It is already unsettling. The myth tells us that the earliest urban civilizations did not imagine death as a sentimental mist. They imagined it as a system. You could arrive there improperly. You could be detained. You could be judged. You might need substitutes, rituals, bargains, or divine intervention. Death was not merely a biological fact. It was a political and legal event in the unseen world. And perhaps that reflects something deeply human. When people live under courts, officials, kings, and temple authorities, they may imagine even death as a court, not because they lack imagination, but because social life teaches the shapes of fear. To be summoned, to be stripped of status, to stand before judges, to hear a decision from which there is no ordinary appeal. These are human experiences made cosmic. The underworld is frightening because it resembles civilization after the warmth has been removed. There are gates, but no welcome. There is authority, but no comfort. There is order, but no mercy easily given. Inanna's myth also shows that Mesopotamian divine politics did not stop at the horizon of the living. The gods had relationships across realms. Ereshkigal's authority had to be respected. Enki's wisdom could still operate at the edge of disaster. Messengers, rituals, and substitutes could move the story forward. But the underworld itself remained grave and resistant. It could be negotiated with, perhaps. It could not be ignored. That distinction matters because it keeps the story from becoming a simple tale of rescue. Inanna's return is not free. In many versions of the tradition, someone must take her place. The logic of the underworld is exchange, balance, replacement. A life returned from below creates a vacancy that must be filled. This is not the soft logic of happy endings. It is the cold accounting of a universe where boundaries mean something. Again, the bureaucratic imagination appears. Even death keeps records. Even return requires procedure. Even a goddess cannot simply walk away from the great below because she prefers the sunlight. For the viewer who comes to the Anunnaki through modern theories, this underworld role is inconvenient. It does not fit easily with the idea of a single group of space travelers descending from a planet to engineer humanity. Why would extraterrestrial colonists become judges in the realm of the dead? Why would their identity shift across myths from high divine powers to underworld authorities? Why would the language around them behave like religious vocabulary rather than technical description? The better explanation is not less interesting. It is that the Anunnaki were part of a religious system large enough to include both heaven and death. Their identity was not confined to a physical origin. It was tied to rank, authority, judgment, and cosmic placement. They could be invoked in relation to the highest gods, but they could also appear in the dark court below. That flexibility is exactly what we would expect from ancient mythological language moving through centuries of tradition. It is not what we would expect from a technical report. This is where careful interpretation becomes essential. The myth of Inanna's descent should not be flattened into a code. It is not secretly telling us about an underground base. It is telling us how Mesopotamians imagined power at the limit of life. It is telling us that even gods could encounter a realm where their usual privileges failed. It is telling us that death, in this worldview, was not the absence of order, but order in its most severe form. And the Anunnaki were seated there. That image changes them. They are no longer only those of Anu, no longer only great powers attached to the grandeur of heaven. They become judges in the place where human ambition ends. They become figures of final authority, not because they arrive with weapons or technology, but because they represent the rule that waits underneath every city, every harvest, every royal inscription, every human plan. The living world may build upward. Death pulls downward. And the Mesopotamians, with their gift for making the invisible administrative, imagined that downward pull as a court. There is a grim honesty in that. No king could bribe his way out forever. No priest could chant away mortality permanently. No worker, no scribe, no warrior, no mother, no ruler could avoid the fact that life moved toward the same hidden country. The underworld judges are terrifying because they are impartial in the broadest sense. Everyone eventually enters their geography, even Inanna. Especially Inanna, because by sending a goddess below, the myth makes death larger than humanity. It is not a punishment for being human. It is a condition of the cosmos. The brightest force must pass through darkness. The most adorned body must be stripped. The highest confidence must meet a gate that does not care how glorious the visitor once appeared. And in that moment, the Anunnaki become something more profound than mysterious ancient names. They become the shape of judgment itself. This darker role prepares us for one of the most unsettling ideas in Mesopotamian myth: that human beings were not created as the beloved center of the universe, but as workers, fashioned to carry burdens the gods no longer wished to bear. The same divine order that judged the dead also had an explanation for why the living had to labor. And that explanation is where the story turns from the court beneath the earth to the workshop of creation. In many later traditions, the creation of humanity becomes a story of dignity. Human beings are made in a special image, given a unique breath, placed at the center of a moral universe, asked to choose, to obey, to love, to fall, to return. Even when the story is stern, humanity often stands close to the heart of divine concern. Mesopotamian creation myth can feel colder, not because it lacks beauty, but because it refuses to flatter us. In the Atrahasis tradition, and in related Mesopotamian stories, the making of humanity is connected to work. The gods have labor to perform. The burden becomes too heavy. There is conflict, exhaustion, complaint. Divine society has a labor problem, and humanity enters the story as the solution. That is one of the most startling ideas in ancient literature. Humans are created so the gods do not have to toil. The first time you hear it, it almost sounds like a grim joke told by a tired farmer at the edge of a field. Why are we here? To dig canals, to carry baskets, to raise food, to maintain the houses of powers greater than ourselves. Not to be cosmic royalty, not to be the beloved audience of heaven's grand performance. To work. And yet, this is exactly where the myth becomes revealing. Mesopotamia was a civilization built on labor so intense and organized that it could not help shaping the sacred imagination. Irrigation agriculture required coordination. Fields had to be managed. Earth had to be moved. Channels had to be cleared again and again, because rivers do not maintain empires out of kindness. Grain had to be produced not only for families, but for temples, palaces, workers, administrators, and armies. Work was not a side detail of life. Work was the condition of civilization. So when Mesopotamian myth imagines the gods growing tired of labor, it is not merely inventing a strange divine episode. It is projecting one of the central pressures of human society upward into the heavens. The gods, like humans, live in an organized world. They have tasks. They have hierarchy. They have burdens. And when the lower gods can no longer tolerate the work, a new being is made to carry it. That being is us. There is no need to exaggerate the darkness of this. The myth does it quietly enough on its own. In some versions of the tradition, humanity is fashioned from clay mixed with a divine element, sometimes associated with the blood or flesh of a slain god. The details vary across texts and traditions, and we have to be careful not to iron them into one single modern storyline. But the broad theme is clear. Humans are made from earthly material and divine substance, bound to both mud and godhood, low enough to serve, yet strange enough to belong partly to the sacred order. That combination is unsettling. It says humanity is not simply dirt, but it also says humanity is not free from obligation. We are mixed beings, useful beings, living tools with voices, hunger, fear, memory, and ritual responsibilities. The myth gives us a kind of dignity, but it is not the comforting dignity of being placed above the world. It is the ambiguous dignity of being necessary to the divine system. The gods need service. Humans provide it. This is one of those details that modern readers often rush past because it does not match what we want creation stories to do. We want origins to explain our greatness. Mesopotamian myth explains our workload. It tells us why the human day is filled with effort, why food does not appear by wishing, why cities demand bodies, why the sacred order requires offerings, maintenance, and obedience. In this sense, creation is not a birthday, it is an assignment, and that assignment reaches directly into temple life. If humans were created to serve the gods, then ritual service was not an optional religious hobby. It was the continuation of humanity's original purpose. Feeding the gods, clothing divine images, maintaining temples, singing hymns, performing offerings. These acts were not decorative. They were the human role made visible. The creation myth gave meaning to obligation. That can sound oppressive, and in many ways it is, but it also gave life a cosmic place. The laborer in the field, was not merely trapped in economic necessity. The priest tending the god's image was not merely performing inherited gestures. The scribe recording offerings was not merely doing paperwork with better handwriting than most of us will ever have. Each was participating, however unequally, in the maintenance of a world where gods and humans were bound together. The problem is that the bond was not equal. The gods create, humans serve. The gods decree, humans endure. The gods may argue about human noise, human numbers, human usefulness, human survival. Humans in the myths are not always invited into that conversation. They are affected by decisions more than they make them. This is the same emotional universe we have already seen in the divine bureaucracy and the underworld court. Humanity lives inside systems of power it can approach, but not command. And that may be the real reason these myths still disturb us. They do not describe evil gods cackling over helpless mortals. They describe a structured universe in which human life is meaningful but subordinate. We matter because we are useful. We are preserved because we serve a function. We are granted rituals, cities, and knowledge, but not full independence from the order that made us. That is a more sophisticated anxiety than simple fear. It is the fear of being necessary but not central. In modern ancient astronaut interpretations, this creation theme is often pulled in a very different direction. The story of gods fashioning humans from clay and divine substance becomes a claim about genetic engineering. The gods' labor problem becomes a mining operation. Divine beings become biological technicians. Mythic language is treated as a coded memory of ancient science. It is easy to see why that reading attracts attention. It turns a disturbing theological idea into a concrete plot. It gives us laboratories, experiments, and a hidden explanation for human origins. It makes the myth feel modern, almost cinematic. And for many people, technology feels more believable than sacred metaphor, even when the evidence for the technological reading is far thinner. But the ancient texts themselves do not need that machinery. They are already speaking about creation, labor, hierarchy, and dependence in terms that fit Mesopotamian society with remarkable precision. Clay matters because people lived in a world built from clay. Tablets, bricks, riverbanks, figurines, fields. Labor matters because cities survived through labor. Divine service matters because temples stood at the center of social and religious order. A human made to work for the gods is not a random fantasy. It is an origin myth shaped by the lived reality of early urban civilization. That does not mean the myth is only social commentary. Ancient myths do not stay in one lane so politely. They are theological, political, poetic, ritual, and psychological at the same time. The creation of humanity speaks to the temple economy, yes, but also to the ache of human existence. Why do we work until our bodies fail? Why do we feed powers we cannot see? Why is life both sacred and exhausting? Why do we carry a spark of something higher while standing ankle-deep in mud? The myth answers with an image. You are clay touched by divinity. You are made for service. You are not nothing. You are not sovereign. That is a hard balance. And it may be one reason these stories feel older than comfort. They come from a world not yet trained to tell humans that the universe revolves around them. Mesopotamian myth looks at humanity and says, "You belong to the structure, but the structure was not built for your pleasure. There is an honesty in that which can feel almost brutal. For the ancient listener, however, the story may not have sounded as bleak as it does to us. To serve the gods was also to participate in cosmic order. To bring offerings, maintain rituals, work the land, and support the temple was to help keep the world functioning. Human labor, however burdensome, had sacred significance. The same canals that exhausted workers also fed cities. The same offerings that reinforced hierarchy also connected the human community with the divine. The myth does not simply degrade humanity. It places humanity in the middle of a demanding relationship. This relationship becomes especially tense in the flood stories, where the gods who created humans to relieve labor later become troubled by the very humanity they have made. The problem is not that humans are useless. The problem is that humans multiply, make noise, disturb divine rest, and become difficult to manage. Creation solves one crisis and creates another. That is painfully recognizable. Every system built to fix a problem produces new problems. A city solves the dangers of isolation, then creates crowding, disease, inequality, and political control. Irrigation feeds people, then demands endless maintenance and produces conflicts over water. Bureaucracy organizes life, then buries it under procedure. Humanity, in the Mesopotamian imagination, is a solution that becomes a disturbance. The gods wanted relief. They got civilization, and civilization is never quiet for long. This is where the creation myths begin to lean toward catastrophe. The divine order that made humanity now has to decide what to do with humanity's excess. Not its sin in the later moral sense necessarily, but its volume, its noise, its sheer unstoppable presence. The human world grows too loud beneath the divine one, and in the Mesopotamian flood traditions, that noise reaches heaven. The story that follows is older than the biblical version most people know, and in some ways more morally complicated. It is not simply about punishment. It is about divine disagreement, failed population control, mercy smuggled through a technicality, and a boat built under the pressure of approaching extinction. Before the ark becomes a symbol in later traditions, it is already floating through the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, carrying one of humanity's oldest fears, that the powers who made us might one day decide there are too many of us. There is a moment in the oldest flood stories when the disaster feels less like a punishment and more like a decision made in a room where humanity is not allowed to speak. That is what makes the Mesopotamian flood tradition so unnerving. The story is not merely that water comes. Water always came in Mesopotamia. The rivers could nourish fields or ruin them. They could be guided by canals, but never fully domesticated. Every farmer knew that civilization depended on water behaving just well enough, for just long enough, under conditions no human hand could completely control. So when the flood enters myth, it brings with it a familiar terror magnified to cosmic scale. In the Atrahasis epic, humanity has multiplied. The world has become crowded with human sound. The noise rises upward, disturbing the gods. And here, the ancient imagination reveals one of its strangest and most revealing details. The crisis is not framed, at least at first, as human wickedness in the way later audiences might expect. The problem is human excess, human presence, human life becoming too much for the divine order that created it. That changes the moral temperature of the story. This is not a simple courtroom drama where humanity is guilty and the flood is a sentence. It is more like a cosmic management crisis. The gods made humans to relieve divine labor, but the solution has grown beyond its intended size. The workers are too many. The noise is unbearable. The system is out of balance, and the gods respond like rulers, not always wisely, not always together. That disagreement among the gods is one of the most important features of the Mesopotamian flood tradition. Divine beings are not shown as one perfectly unified will. They debate, they conflict, they act at cross purposes. Some push toward destruction, others preserve life. The result is a myth where humanity survives not because the divine order is simple, but because it is divided. This is where Enki, or Ea, becomes crucial. In the Atrahasis tradition, when destruction approaches, the wise god does not always oppose the decision in a direct, open rebellion. His intelligence is subtler. He finds a way to warn the human survivor, Atrahasis, while still navigating the boundaries of divine command. The warning can come through a dream or through speech directed in a way that avoids the most direct violation. The details vary in the wider tradition, but the pattern is unmistakable. Wisdom moves through a narrow opening in the wall of authority. That is very Mesopotamian. The world is ruled by decrees, but survival may depend on interpretation. A command has power, but so does clever speech. A fate may be declared, but a wise god may still find a technical route around catastrophe. This is not the morality of a simple children's tale. It is the morality of a court, a bureaucracy, a dangerous hierarchy where words matter and phrasing can save lives. Enki does not need to smash the whole divine system to preserve humanity. He uses the system's own texture, ambiguity, ritual, dreams, indirect speech, to slip mercy through. The chosen human is told to build, and this, too, matters. Survival does not arrive as pure miracle. It arrives as work. A boat must be constructed. Instructions must be followed. Time must be used properly. The human survivor is not the master of the disaster, but neither is he passive. He acts under warning, under pressure, in a world where obedience to wisdom becomes the thin line between memory and extinction. Then the waters come. In later imagination, flood stories often become clean symbols. The ark floats, the rain falls, the world is washed. A new beginning waits. But in the Mesopotamian versions, the atmosphere is more disturbing. The flood is overwhelming enough that even the gods are shaken by what they have unleashed. Some traditions describe divine fear, hunger, or regret after humanity has been nearly erased. The destruction solves the noise problem, but creates another one. Without humans, who will feed the gods? Who will maintain the offerings? Who will perform the service for which humanity was made? Here the myth turns sharply. The flood exposes the dependence hidden inside hierarchy. The gods may be greater than humans, but the relationship is not one-directional. Human beings need divine order, protection, water, fertility, and fate. But the gods, in these myths, also need human service. They need offerings. They need temples. They need the laboring species whose existence had once been a solution to divine toil. The flood nearly destroys the very system it was meant to stabilize. That is a profound piece of ancient political insight. Power can become so irritated by the noise of its subjects that it forgets it depends on them. A ruler may wish for silence, but a silent city is not a successful city. A temple without worshippers is not a functioning temple. A field without workers is not an estate. The divine order needs humanity alive, but manageable. Productive, but not disruptive. Numerous enough to serve, but not numerous enough to disturb. The flood myth is not only about water, it is about control. After the waters recede, the story does not simply return to the earlier world. Measures are introduced to limit human expansion and reduce the possibility of the same crisis repeating. Mortality, infertility, infant mortality, social roles connected to childlessness or religious service. Different elements appear in the broader tradition as ways of keeping the human population within bounds. The exact details must be handled carefully, because Mesopotamian texts come down to us through versions and fragments. But the larger idea is clear. After the flood, humanity continues under new constraints. The gods do not decide that humans should flourish without limit. They decide humans must be regulated. This is where the Mesopotamian flood tradition differs in mood from many later retellings. It does not end with uncomplicated comfort. Yes, survival matters. Yes, life continues. Yes, the human line is preserved. But the preservation comes with a darker recognition. The same powers that allow humanity to endure are also willing to restrict it. Mercy and management arrive together. The Epic of Gilgamesh preserves another famous version of the flood story, where Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh how he survived the great deluge and was granted a kind of immortality. But even there, the flood is not merely an adventure tale. It appears inside Gilgamesh's desperate search for escape from death. The king of Uruk, mighty and grief-stricken, wants to know whether mortality can be defeated. He finds a man who survived the waters, only to learn that his case is exceptional, distant, almost unreachable. The flood survivor becomes a witness, not a solution. For Gilgamesh, the story does not open a path to easy immortality. It teaches him the opposite. The ancient catastrophe may have spared one man, but it does not spare everyone. The flood becomes part of a larger meditation on human limits. Even kings die. Even heroes fail. Even those who hear the oldest secrets must return to the city and live within the boundaries set for human beings. That is why these flood traditions are so powerful. They operate on several levels at once. They remember the danger of real floods in river civilizations. They explain humanity's precarious relationship with divine authority. They explore the problem of population and noise. They dramatize disagreement among the gods. They preserve the figure of the wise divine helper who protects life through cunning. And later, in the Gilgamesh tradition, they become part of the oldest literary confrontation with death itself. Modern audiences often approach the Mesopotamian flood through the shadow of the biblical story, because that is the version many people know first. But the older Mesopotamian material shows that the flood motif was already circulating in the ancient Near East before it entered later traditions. This does not mean every version is identical. It means cultures inherited, reshaped, argued with, and reinterpreted a powerful memory of world-destroying water. The story traveled because it could carry many meanings. Flood is historical enough to be believable, cosmic enough to be terrifying, moral enough to be interpreted, natural enough to happen again. In Mesopotamia, where the rivers made civilization possible, flood was the perfect image of divine ambivalence. Water gives life, but too much water erases the line between field and river, city and swamp, home and ruin. The same force that fills the canals can drown the world. That is exactly the kind of double power Mesopotamian religion understood well. Blessing and disaster are not always opposites. Sometimes they come from the same source, altered only by measure. Too little water, famine. Enough water, civilization. Too much water, apocalypse. It is difficult to imagine a more precise theology for a river world. The Anunnaki are not always the central named actors in every flood version, and we should not force them into places where the texts do not clearly put them. But the flood belongs to the same universe they inhabit, a cosmos of divine counsels, decrees, human service, contested mercy, and terrifying decisions. The great gods debate humanity's fate. Human beings are vulnerable not only to nature, but to divine policy. Survival depends on the intervention of wisdom within a hierarchy that might otherwise choose silence. And that returns us to the central question of this whole mystery. Not whether ancient tablets secretly describe spaceships, but why the first written civilizations imagined humanity's origin, labor, survival, and near destruction through the language of divine administration. The flood story is one of the clearest answers, because life in the earliest cities already felt administered. Water was administered through canals, grain through storehouses, labor through institutions, law through courts, kingship through divine legitimacy, ritual through temples. And above all of this, myth imagined the gods administering existence itself. The flood is what happens when administration becomes catastrophe. A decision is made. The waters rise. The world is almost returned to silence. And then, through warning, craft, and fragile obedience, a remnant survives. That survival is not triumphant in the modern heroic sense. It is humbling. Humanity lives on, but not because it has conquered the gods or mastered the world. Humanity lives on because destruction was interrupted, because wisdom took pity, because the system that nearly erased us still required our presence. There is something deeply uncomfortable in that. We are preserved, but not in control. We are necessary, but not safe. We are remembered, but also regulated. And after the flood, the question of who rules the human world becomes even more urgent. If human life survives by divine permission, then human authority must also be explained through divine permission. Cities need kings. Kings need legitimacy. Legitimacy must come from somewhere higher than ambition. So Mesopotamian tradition gives us one of its most famous political ideas. Kingship descended from heaven, not elected by the crowd, not invented by the strong, but lowered into the human world as a sacred institution, a claim that would shape how rulers imagined power, how scribes recorded the past, and how cities told stories about their own right to rule. After the flood, the world does not simply begin again as an empty field. It begins again with a problem. Human beings have survived. Cities will rise. Fields will be worked. Temples will be served. But survival alone is not civilization. A crowd of people is not yet a kingdom. A settlement is not yet an ordered city. Someone must decide, command, judge, defend, distribute, punish, build, and claim the right to do all of this without being seen as merely the strongest person in the room. That is where kingship enters the story. In Mesopotamian thought, kingship was not treated as an ordinary human invention. It was imagined as something granted from above, a sacred institution that could descend from heaven into the human world. This idea appears powerfully in the tradition of the Sumerian king list, where kingship is presented as moving from city to city across deep time, interrupted by catastrophe, then restored. The details are legendary, and many of the early reigns listed are impossibly long by ordinary historical standards. But that is exactly why the document is so revealing. It is not just recording politics. It is turning politics into cosmic memory. The Sumerian king list does something very clever. It takes the messy reality of rival cities, changing dynasties, conquest, collapse, and local ambition, and arranges it into a sacred sequence. Kingship belongs first here, then there. It descends. It transfers. It survives the flood. It gives the past a structure that looks less like chaos and more like a divine plan moving through history. This is not history in the modern academic sense. It is political theology, and political theology is never innocent. To say that kingship came from heaven is to say that rule has a source above human argument. A king is not merely a successful warlord with better public relations, though one suspects there were plenty of those. He is presented as the earthly holder of an office rooted in divine order. His authority does not begin with his appetite for power. It begins, at least in the official story, with the gods. That claim mattered. In a world of city-states, shifting alliances, irrigation disputes, temple wealth, border conflicts, and vulnerable harvests, authority needed more than force. Force can seize a city, but it cannot easily make people believe the seizure is right. Sacred legitimacy helped solve that problem. It wrapped power in an older language. It said the throne was not simply occupied, it had been authorized. The difference is enormous. A man with soldiers can make people obey. A king chosen by the gods can make obedience feel like participation in the order of the world. That does not mean everyone believed every royal claim in the same way. Ancient people were not blank clay waiting for propaganda to press itself into them. They saw bad rulers. They suffered failed policies. They knew violence when it arrived at their gates. But official ideology does not need to erase doubt entirely. It needs to shape the terms in which power is explained. And in Mesopotamia, one of the strongest explanations was that kingship belonged to the divine structure of reality. The throne was human. Kingship was heavenly. This distinction is subtle but important. A particular king could fail, die, be overthrown, or lose divine favor. The institution of kingship, however, could remain sacred. That allowed Mesopotamian tradition to explain political change without abandoning the idea of divine order. If one city fell and another rose, kingship had not been destroyed. It had moved. If one dynasty ended, the office itself remained. The gods could withdraw favor from one ruler and place it elsewhere. Power, in this imagination, was portable because heaven could transfer it. This made history feel governed. It also made history terrifying, because if kingship can descend, it can also depart. A city might believe itself favored, protected by its god, rich in temples and walls. Then famine comes, Enemies gather, omens trouble the court, the army fails, the gates break. Suddenly the old certainty looks fragile. Perhaps the gods have turned their faces away. Perhaps kingship has moved on. Perhaps the city's place in the sacred sequence has ended. That fear echoes through Mesopotamian laments for ruined cities. The fall of a city was not merely a military disaster. It was a theological wound. The destruction of walls, temples, and homes raised a question more painful than strategy. Why did the divine order allow this? Did the city's god abandon it? Did higher powers decree its fall? Was disaster random, or had destiny been assigned? The idea of heavenly kingship gave power meaning, but it also made collapse meaningful. And meaningful collapse can be harder to bear than meaningless collapse. This is where the Anunnaki's wider world comes back into view. A cosmos of divine counsels and decrees naturally supports a politics of sacred authorization. If gods assign destinies, then the destiny of a city can be assigned. If heaven holds authority, then earthly authority must somehow descend from heaven. If the universe is structured like a hierarchy, then kingship is not an accident inside that hierarchy. It is one of its central channels. In this sense, the king stood between worlds, not fully divine in the ordinary Mesopotamian pattern, though some rulers in some periods claimed extraordinary status. Not merely ordinary either. The king was the human point, where divine command touched administration. Building temples, leading armies, making judgments, maintaining canals, sponsoring rituals, and presenting himself as shepherd of the people. Shepherd is one of those royal images that sounds gentle until you think about it. A shepherd protects, yes, but a shepherd also controls movement, manages breeding, selects, separates, and sometimes slaughters. Royal metaphors are rarely as soft as they first appear. The king as shepherd suggests care within hierarchy. He exists for the welfare of the flock, but the flock does not govern him. The image fits a world where order is valued, but equality is not the organizing ideal. To modern ears, that may sound uncomfortable. To ancient city societies, it could sound reassuring. A good shepherd meant protection from predators, direction through danger, and survival through seasons that could kill. But the same metaphor could hide exploitation. That is the double edge of sacred kingship. It can bind a ruler to responsibility because he must maintain justice and divine favor. Yet it can also elevate his commands beyond ordinary criticism. If the king speaks for divine order, resistance becomes more than political disobedience. It can be framed as rebellion against the structure of the world. This is why the phrase, kingship from heaven, is so powerful. It is beautiful. It is dangerous. It turns the throne into a bridge between cosmic order and human control. The Sumerian king list uses that bridge to organize memory itself. The earliest kings appear before the flood with reigns so vast they belong more to mythic time than to ordinary chronology. Then comes the flood, that great rupture in the human story. After it, kingship descends again. Civilization resumes, but not as a random restart. It resumes under a restored institution. The message is clear. Catastrophe interrupts, but sacred order returns. That was not only a comforting idea, it was a political one. A ruler who could place himself inside the long chain of kingship could claim continuity with something older than his own reign. He was not just the man currently sitting on the throne. He was the latest holder of an office that had passed through cities, survived destruction, and belonged ultimately to the gods. Every regime wants a past. The king list gives kingship an ancient past so vast it touches the edge of myth. Modern readers sometimes look at the enormous reign lengths and dismiss the text as fantasy. That is understandable but too quick. The impossible numbers are not a failure of imagination. They are a clue to genre. They tell us that the text is not doing what a modern historical database does. It is placing early kings in a time when human and divine history were closer together, when the origins of rule had to feel larger than normal life. The exaggeration has a purpose. It makes kingship ancient enough to be unquestionable. If a throne can trace its logic back before ordinary memory, then it becomes harder to see it as temporary human construction. It feels rooted in the deep foundation of the world. That is the kind of legitimacy rulers dream of. But the dream never fully hides the anxiety underneath. If kingship is granted by gods, then human rulers are dependent. If the gods appoint, they can remove. If the city's glory is divinely favored, its ruin may be divinely permitted. The king stands high, but under judgment. He commands humans, yet answers to powers above him. His grandeur is real, but borrowed. Borrowed power is always nervous. This nervousness helps explain the intensity of royal rituals, inscriptions, temple building, and public devotion. A king had to show that he was maintaining the relationship with the gods. Building or restoring temples was not just piety. It was political communication. Victories were not just military events. They were proof of favor. Justice was not only good administration. It reflected the proper order expected by the divine world. The ruler's body may have sat in the palace, but his legitimacy had to be staged before heaven. And everyone knew heaven was watching through signs. This brings us toward another essential feature of Mesopotamian thought: the connection between divine power and the sky. If kingship descended from heaven, then heaven itself had to be read. The night sky was not a silent backdrop. It was a field of messages, patterns, omens, and divine associations. The movements of stars and planets could matter to kings because the heavens were part of the same order that granted kingship in the first place. The political world and the celestial world were not separate theaters. They were connected levels of one system. This is where the modern fascination with the Anunnaki often takes a sharp turn, because once we hear that kingship came from heaven, that gods were linked with celestial bodies, and that Mesopotamian scholars studied the sky with extraordinary seriousness, it becomes tempting to translate heaven into outer space and divine descent into physical arrival. But that leap changes the language before understanding it. For Mesopotamians, heaven was not merely a location above the atmosphere. It was the high realm of authority and signs. To say kingship descended from heaven was not necessarily to describe an object traveling downward through air. It was to say that political order had a source beyond human manufacture. The phrase is theological, ideological, and symbolic before it is anything else. Treating it as a literal flight path may make the story sound more modern, but it can also make it less ancient. And the ancient version is already rich enough. A civilization built cities from mud and memory, watched its rivers with fear, served gods in temples, imagined humanity as laboring for divine powers. and explained kingship as a sacred office descending through history. That is not a small idea. It is one of humanity's earliest attempts to answer the question every political system still faces: why should anyone have the right to rule? Mesopotamia answered, because rule itself comes from above. Not always this ruler, not always this city, but kingship, the institution, the sacred burden of command. It descended. It moved. It could be lost. And with that belief, earthly politics became part of cosmic drama. A king was not just a man in a palace. He was a temporary bearer of heavenly authority, standing beneath gods whose decrees shaped the fate of cities. His throne was made of human materials, but its meaning reached upward into the divine order. And above that throne, night after night, stretched the sky. Not empty, not decorative, but alive with signs that trained observers would learn to read with patient and astonishing care. Because in Mesopotamia, the heavens did not merely inspire wonder. They gave warnings. They kept time. They reflected divine intention. And for kings who believed their power came from above, there may have been no text on earth more urgent than the one written in the stars. To the people of ancient Mesopotamia, the night sky was not empty. It was not a distant decoration above the real business of life. It was part of the real business of life. The stars, the moon, the wandering planets, the rhythm of months, the strange appearances of eclipses and comets. All of these belong to a world of signs. Heaven was not silent space. It was a surface on which meaning could appear. This is where we have to be especially careful. Mesopotamia did have a profound connection between religion and the sky. Its scholars observed celestial movements with patience and seriousness. Gods were associated with heavenly bodies. Astral omens mattered to kings. Calendars depended on the moon. Ritual time was coordinated with the heavens. The sky was watched, recorded, interpreted. But that does not mean the ancient texts are secretly describing astronauts. It means the sky was sacred. That difference may seem small at first, but it changes everything. For a modern person, the sky is often divided into two categories. There is the scientific sky, filled with planets, stars, gravity, radiation, orbital mechanics, and unimaginable distances. And then there is the poetic sky where we put metaphors, wishes, moods, and the occasional dramatic thought at 2 a.m. Mesopotamia did not make that division in the same way. Observation and meaning belong together. A celestial event could be real, measurable, and sacred at the same time. A planet could be an object seen in the sky. It could also be a divine sign. The moon was not only useful for keeping time, it was connected to divine order and ritual rhythm. The sun was not only a bright body crossing the day, it was bound to justice, visibility, and the exposing power of light. Venus, with its striking appearances as morning and evening star, was associated with Inanna and Ishtar, whose own nature crossed boundaries of love, war, desire, and sovereignty. The heavens were not a blank ceiling above the gods. They were one of the ways divine presence became readable. Readable, however, does not mean easy. The sky required experts. This is another detail often lost in modern retellings. Mesopotamian celestial interpretation was not just a crowd of people looking up and saying, "That seems ominous," which, to be fair, is still a popular human response to unusual lights. It involved trained scribes and scholars, people who belonged to a long tradition of recording, comparing, and interpreting signs. Over time, they built systems for reading omens from the heavens, especially when those omens concerned the king and the state. The ruler had reason to care. If kingship descended from heaven, then changes in heaven might say something about kingship. An eclipse was not merely an astronomical event. It could be politically dangerous. A strange appearance in the sky could become a warning. The heavens were watched because the fate of cities might be thought to tremble there. This does not mean every omen was handled with panic or blind superstition. The tradition was far more disciplined than that. Omens had patterns, interpretive rules, archives, precedents, ritual responses. A sign could be read, classified, and answered. The goal was not simply to be afraid of the sky. The goal was to understand what heaven was communicating and to respond before disaster became unavoidable. Once again, we meet the Mesopotamian genius for administration. Even the stars are brought into procedure. The night sky becomes a kind of archive, a warning system, a calendar, a royal advisory board, though admittedly one with terrible handwriting and no interest in simplifying its message. This is one of the reasons Mesopotamian religion can feel so intellectually rich. It did not imagine divine power as vague atmosphere alone. It placed meaning into patterns. The movement of celestial bodies could be studied because the universe itself was ordered. If the gods governed reality, then reality might show traces of governance. To observe the heavens was not merely to admire beauty, it was to attend to the outer surface of divine intention. That idea may feel foreign now, but it is not childish. It belongs to a world where uncertainty was dangerous and signs mattered. A king wanted to know whether war should begin. A city feared plague. A court worried over succession. Farmers depended on seasonal timing. Priests had to maintain proper ritual calendars. In such a world, the sky offered something precious: regularity, pattern, and occasionally disruption. The regular movements reassured. The disruptions warned. A predictable moon helped order time. An eclipse broke the comfort of that order. And where order broke, interpretation began. This is where the Anunnaki enter the modern imagination by a side door. Because once gods are linked with the heavens, once stars and planets are sacred, once divine authority is described as coming from above, it becomes tempting to read the entire religious system through the language of space travel. Heaven becomes outer space. Divine descent becomes arrival. Astral association becomes planetary origin. A mythic sky becomes an astrophysical map. But this translation is too fast. It removes the ancient meaning and replaces it with a modern one. For Mesopotamians, heaven was not just a place one might travel from. It was a level of cosmic authority. To say a god belonged to the heavens did not require that god to be an extraterrestrial passenger. It meant that the god participated in a realm of height, order, brightness, and command. It meant the sky was alive with divine significance. It meant celestial bodies could be signs, not vehicles. The real connection between the Anunnaki tradition and the stars is therefore not weak. It is just not the connection modern speculation often wants. The Mesopotamians did not need aliens to make the sky meaningful. Their sky was already dense with power. It was where time was measured, omens appeared, divine identities shone, and political anxiety found one of its grandest stages. If a king wanted to know whether heaven favored him, he did not need to imagine a spaceship hidden behind Saturn. He needed scholars who could read the signs. That may sound less spectacular, but it is historically more astonishing. Because what we are seeing is one of humanity's earliest sustained attempts to connect observation with interpretation. Not science in the modern sense, and not mere fantasy either. Something older, hybrid, and deeply human. The belief that careful attention to the world can reveal hidden order. This belief shaped calendars, rituals, royal decisions, and the intellectual life of scribal culture. It also shaped the emotional atmosphere of Mesopotamian civilization. Imagine living in a city where the sky above you is not neutral. Every night, it opens like a written field. The moon's shape matters. The planet's positions matter. An eclipse may disturb the palace. A star's appearance may be entered into a tradition of warnings. The heavens are beautiful, yes, but beauty is not their main function. They are watching. Or perhaps more precisely, they are being watched because they may reveal what the watchers cannot otherwise know. There is a subtle difference between those two ideas, and Mesopotamia lived inside it. The gods were not imagined as distant abstractions sealed away from the material world. They disclosed themselves through signs, in dreams, births, livers of sacrificial animals, weather, illness, and the sky. The celestial realm was one part of a larger system of divination, a way of approaching the hidden decisions behind visible events. The heavens mattered because they were both high and ordered, both mysterious and patterned. A chaos that repeats itself is no longer chaos. It becomes a code, and Mesopotamian scholars became readers of that code. This is why the sky could be frightening without being meaningless. A darkened moon might carry danger, but danger could be interpreted. An omen could be met with ritual. A warning could be taken seriously. The future was not fully open, but it was not wholly unreadable either. The gods might decree, but they might also signal. Humanity's position remained subordinate, yet not entirely blind. That is an important balance. Mesopotamian thought often presents humans as small within a vast order, but small does not mean stupid. Small does not mean passive. The scribe watching the heavens participates in the cosmic system through knowledge. He cannot command the moon, but he can record its behavior. He cannot overrule a divine warning, but he can help the king respond. He cannot climb into heaven, but he can read what heaven displays. In that sense, astronomy and divination gave humanity a narrow dignity. Not mastery, attention. And attention is one of the oldest forms of power. This is very different from the modern ancient astronaut version, where the sky becomes the home address of advanced beings. In that version, the stars matter because someone came from them. In the Mesopotamian version, the stars matter because they participate in the order of meaning itself. They are not merely destinations, they are signs, not empty lights in the background, but part of the divine language through which the universe speaks. This does not make the ancient world less mysterious. It makes the mystery deeper, because it suggests that the earliest cities were not only building upward in brick and ambition, they were also building systems of thought that connected the ground beneath their feet to the sky above their heads, canals below, temples in the city, gods in their houses, kings on thrones, omens in the heavens. The whole structure was joined by the belief that reality was layered, governed, and readable. When we hear that gods were associated with stars and planets, we should not flatten that into a single modern claim. We should pause inside the older imagination. The people of Mesopotamia did not look up and see empty darkness sprinkled with decorative points. They saw a field of divine significance. They saw calendars, warnings, royal fate, ritual timing, and the shining traces of powers greater than themselves. And perhaps that is why the Anunnaki eventually became so easy to reinvent. Their world already pointed upward. Their stories already spoke of heaven. Their civilization already treated the sky as charged with intelligence. All the ingredients were there for later centuries to misunderstand in a new direction. Because when modern people lost the old religious grammar but kept the fascination, the sky changed meaning. Heaven became space. Gods became visitors. Omens became evidence. Myth became a report waiting to be decoded by people who believed the scholars had missed the obvious. That transformation did not happen in ancient Sumer. It happened much later. And to understand it, we have to leave the temple city for a different kind of mythology. The 20th century world of alternative history, paperback speculation, mistrust of official explanations, and the powerful modern desire to believe that ancient myths are not symbolic memories of human imagination, but damaged records of contact. This is where the Anunnaki become aliens, not in the clay tablets themselves, in us. The transformation begins quietly, almost innocently, with a change in the way modern people hear ancient words. A god descends from heaven. To an ancient listener, that phrase belongs to a religious universe. Heaven is authority. Heaven is height. Heaven is the realm of divine order. The descent may mean the arrival of power, legitimacy, presence, or fate into the human world. But to a modern listener raised in the age of rockets, satellites, science fiction, and grainy footage of astronauts stepping onto the moon, the phrase can sound very different. A god descends from heaven. Suddenly, heaven becomes outer space. Descent becomes landing. Divine radiance becomes advanced technology. Creation becomes genetic engineering. And myth becomes a damaged eyewitness account. This is the great modern turn in the story of the Anunnaki. Not the moment they first appeared in ancient Mesopotamia, but the moment they were removed from that world and placed into ours. The temple became a launch site. The divine council became a command structure. The clay of creation became biology. The sky god became a clue. And the old question, what did these people believe, was replaced by a more thrilling one. What if they were describing something real, but did not have the vocabulary to understand it? It is a seductive question. That is part of the problem. Because it sounds respectful at first. It seems to say ancient people saw something extraordinary, and modern scholars are too narrow to admit it. But underneath, it often does something less generous. It assumes that ancient people could not create profound religious thought on their own. It suggests that myths must be misunderstood technology, because myth itself is not impressive enough. That is a strange kind of admiration. It praises ancient civilizations by taking their imagination away from them. The ancient astronaut idea did not appear from nowhere. It grew in the 20th century, in a world shaped by aviation, nuclear weapons, the space race, UFO sightings, Cold War secrecy, and a widening suspicion that governments and experts were hiding more than they revealed. The sky had changed. It was no longer only the home of gods, angels, omens, and weather. It had become a frontier of machines. Humans had flown above the clouds, sent probes into darkness, and watched rockets rise from fire. Once that happened, old myths began to look different to some readers. Stories of gods coming down from heaven were no longer read only as theology. They were read as memory. Stories of strange beings teaching humanity were no longer read only as cultural myth. They became hints of contact. Monuments, ziggurats, pyramids, stone circles, calendars, and ancient astronomy were gathered into a single emotional argument. Perhaps humanity had help. That word, help, carries more weight than it seems, because ancient astronaut theories are rarely only about aliens. They are about discomfort with human history. They begin from a feeling that the past is too impressive, too strange, too mathematically elegant, too large in stone, too ambitious in scale for ordinary human societies to have created it without outside intervention. But ordinary human societies are not ordinary when you look at them closely. They are capable of obsession. They can organize labor on staggering scales. They can build for gods, kings, ancestors, and future memory. They can spend generations perfecting techniques that seem impossible to those who have never tried them. They can study the sky for centuries. They can encode ritual, politics, and mathematics into architecture. They can do all this without engines from another planet. The ancient world does not become less remarkable when we remove aliens from it. It becomes more remarkable. Still, the alien version has power because it offers a clean story. It says the mystery is not really social, religious, political, or psychological. It is technological. The gods were advanced beings. The temples were misunderstood infrastructure. The myths were reports. The priests were preserving memories of contact. The scholars are looking at symbols, but the symbols are actually clues. This turns the past into a puzzle box, and puzzle boxes are hard to resist. The Anunnaki were especially vulnerable to this transformation because their mythological world already contained several ingredients that modern speculation loves. They were ancient. Their names sounded unfamiliar and severe. They were linked to Anu, the sky god. They belonged to a cosmos of heaven, earth, and underworld. Mesopotamian texts included creation myths, flood stories, divine councils, kingship descending from heaven, and gods associated with stars and planets. To a careful historian, these are features of Mesopotamian religion. To a speculative writer, they can become evidence of extraterrestrial intervention. The same details are being read through two entirely different grammars. In the ancient grammar, gods are gods. The sky is sacred authority. Creation myths explain labor and divine service. Flood stories explore cosmic order and human vulnerability. Kingship from heaven legitimizes political power. Astral omens connect celestial events with divine signs. In the modern ancient astronaut grammar, gods are aliens. The sky is space. Creation is engineering. The flood may be disaster management. Kingship is delegated rule. Omens are misunderstood astronomy, or perhaps records of planetary events. The shift is not in the tablets alone. The shift is in the reader. This matters because many popular claims about the Anunnaki rely on a kind of translation by mood. A phrase sounds technological, so it is treated as technological. A story feels too strange, so it is assumed to describe machinery. A god acts with knowledge beyond humans, so that knowledge becomes science. A divine realm lies above, so above becomes an orbital location. But ancient language does not become technical just because a modern reader can imagine a machine behind it. When a myth says a god fashioned humanity, that does not automatically mean a laboratory. When a text says kingship descended from heaven, that does not automatically mean a spacecraft delivered political software, however memorable that would be. When a planet or star is linked to a deity, that does not make the deity an astronaut from that celestial body. We have to be careful with what if. What if is useful when it opens inquiry. It becomes dangerous when it replaces evidence. The ancient astronaut version of the Anunnaki also depends on compression. Thousands of years of Mesopotamian tradition, with different languages, cities, scribal schools, theological developments, and literary genres, are squeezed into one simplified storyline. The Anunnaki become a single species. Their motives become consistent. Their identity becomes fixed. The uncertainty and variation of the sources are treated not as historical complexity, but as fragments of a hidden truth. That makes the story easier to follow. It also makes it less faithful to the ancient material. The real Mesopotamian record is not a straight line. It is a landscape of overlapping traditions, Sumerian compositions, Akkadian adaptations, Babylonian scholarship, Assyrian royal ideology, local cults, divine name lists, myths copied by scribes long after their earliest forms. All of these preserve pieces of a religious world that changed over time. The Anunnaki do not behave like a single modern category because they were never designed for modern categories. Yet the alien theory survives by offering certainty where the sources offer difficulty. That certainty is emotionally satisfying. It gives ancient mystery a plot. It gives human origins a secret. It gives religion a technological explanation. It gives distrust a target. Mainstream scholars, museums, governments, priests, institutions, anyone accused of hiding the truth. And once a theory has an enemy, it becomes much harder to dislodge, because disbelief can be folded back into the theory as proof that the cover-up continues. This is not unique to the Anunnaki. Many alternative histories work this way. They begin with real mysteries, real gaps, real lost contexts, real scholarly uncertainties. Then they fill those gaps with an answer more dramatic than the evidence allows. The result feels like revelation, especially to people who already suspect that official history is too tidy. And to be fair, official history can be tidy. Textbooks simplify. Museums compress. Scholars disagree in language that rarely reaches the public. Ancient history is full of missing pieces, damaged tablets, uncertain readings, and debates that do not fit neatly into a 2-minute explanation. There is room for wonder. There is room for humility. There is room to say, "We do not know." But "we do not know" is not the same as "therefore aliens." The gap between those two statements is where much of modern mythology is made. What makes the Anunnaki alien theory so compelling is that it does not feel, to its believers, like fantasy. It feels like decoding. It feels like pulling a hidden wire through 1,000 years of stories and discovering that every myth was pointing to the same secret. The more ancient the source, the more powerful the claim appears. The stranger the translation, the more exciting the possibility. But history is not solved by excitement. It is solved slowly and imperfectly by context. Context asks what a word meant in its own language, what genre the text belongs to, what other texts say, what the culture believed about gods, kings, death, labor, and the sky, what later copies changed, what cannot be recovered, what modern assumptions we may be smuggling into ancient sentences. The ancient astronaut theory often runs in the opposite direction. It starts with the modern conclusion and gathers ancient fragments that seem to glow in its light. This does not mean every person drawn to the theory is foolish. Many are responding to something real. The shock of discovering how old, complex, and strange Mesopotamian civilization was. The problem is not curiosity. Curiosity is the beginning of all good history. The problem is when curiosity is trained to distrust the evidence whenever the evidence refuses to become a thriller. Because the historical Anunnaki are not boring. They are not less mysterious because they are gods rather than aliens. In some ways, they are more disturbing as gods. They show us a civilization trying to understand power before philosophy, politics, science, and religion had separated into modern categories. They show us a world where the universe was imagined as ranked, administered, readable, and dangerous. They connect creation with labor, kingship with heaven, death with judgment, and the stars with divine signs. That is not a small mystery. It is one of the oldest records of the human mind trying to locate itself beneath powers it could not master. The alien version narrows that mystery into an origin claim. It asks, did beings from another planet make us? The ancient version asks something wider. Why did humans imagine themselves as created for service, ruled by destiny, watched by the heavens, judged below the earth, and dependent on divine decisions for survival? One question points outward, the other points inward, into civilization itself. And perhaps that is why the modern reinterpretation became so popular. It lets us keep the awe of religion while replacing the obligations of religion with technology. Aliens do not demand worship in the same way gods do. They may experiment, deceive, instruct, or depart. But they belong to a universe modern people feel they understand: biology, planets, machines, advanced knowledge. They make myth feel scientific without requiring the discipline of science or the humility of reading ancient religion on its own terms. The result is a new mythology wearing the skin of an old one. And like many myths, it reveals the needs of the people who tell it. The 20th century did not invent wonder. It inherited wonder and mechanized it. It looked at the old gods and imagined pilots. It looked at divine creation and imagined laboratories. It looked at celestial signs and imagined homeworlds. It looked at the Anunnaki and saw not the divine bureaucracy of Mesopotamia, but a lost civilization of star-born rulers. That story would soon find its most influential voice in one man, Zecharia Sitchin. For many readers, Sitchin did not merely popularize the Anunnaki alien theory. He gave it architecture. He connected the gods to a planet called Nibiru, proposed a hidden history of human origins, and offered translations that seemed to unlock the tablets themselves. His books reached far beyond academic Assyriology, shaping decades of alternative history internet speculation, and late-night fascination. But the more carefully we examine his claims, the more important the distinction becomes between cultural impact and historical evidence. Because Sitchin changed the modern Anunnaki, the question is whether he understood the ancient ones. Zecharia Sitchin did not invent the human fascination with sky gods, but he gave that fascination a modern plot. In the late 20th century, his books helped turn the Anunnaki from figures of Mesopotamian mythology into characters in an alternative history of the human species. For readers already suspicious of official explanations, Sitchin offered something intoxicating. Not merely another interpretation of ancient myths, but the claim that the myths had been misunderstood all along. The gods, he argued, were not gods. They were beings from another world, and that world, in his system, was Nibiru. Nibiru became the great hidden engine of the theory, a mysterious planet associated with the Anunnaki, imagined as moving through the solar system on a long cycle, periodically approaching Earth and allowing its inhabitants to intervene in human affairs. From there, the story expanded. The Anunnaki came to Earth. They sought resources. They engineered humanity. They became the gods of ancient texts because early humans, unable to understand advanced technology, described these beings in religious language. It is a powerful narrative. It has scale, secrecy, danger, and the thrill of forbidden knowledge. It takes fragments of ancient literature and arranges them into a cosmic drama stretching from Mesopotamian tablets to the origins of civilization itself. It promises that the oldest myths are not symbolic, not theological, not political, but literal history preserved in disguise. That promise is why Sitchin mattered. He did not write like an academic Assyriologist addressing a narrow circle of specialists. He wrote for a broad audience hungry for revelation. His work arrived in a cultural atmosphere already primed by UFO debates, space exploration, Cold War secrecy, distrust of institutions, and the growing popularity of alternative archaeology. He offered readers a way to feel that the ancient world was not merely old, but encrypted. And once history feels encrypted, every detail becomes suspicious. A god associated with heaven becomes a traveler from space. A strange word becomes a clue. A mythic creation scene becomes biological engineering. A divine council becomes a political meeting of extraterrestrial elites. A celestial name becomes a planet. A symbol becomes a map. A gap in evidence becomes not a limitation, but a hiding place. This is the emotional architecture of the theory. It does not simply say, "Here is what happened." It says, "Here is what they did not want you to understand." That second sentence is the stronger one, because it turns disagreement into drama. If specialists object, their objections can be dismissed as gatekeeping. If translations differ, the alternative translation becomes the brave one. If evidence is missing, perhaps it was suppressed, lost, or deliberately ignored. The theory becomes difficult to challenge because challenge itself can be absorbed into the story. But cultural power is not the same as historical reliability. And here, Sitchin's work runs into serious problems. Mainstream Assyriologists have not accepted his readings of Mesopotamian texts. The objections are not minor quibbles over tone or preference. They concern translation, context, philology, and method, the very tools required to understand ancient writing. Sumerian and Akkadian are not languages where one can simply select the most dramatic possible meaning and build a planetary history around it. Words live inside grammar, genre, scribal convention, and parallel usage. If those controls are ignored, translation becomes imagination wearing a scholar's coat. The issue is not that ancient texts contain no mysteries. They contain many. The issue is that Sitchin often treated ambiguity as permission. Where the sources are complex, he made them direct. Where the language is religious, he made it technical. Where the context is mythological, he made it historical in the modern, literal sense. Where a term has a known range of ancient meanings, he could press it into the service of his larger theory. The result was exciting, but excitement is not the same thing as accuracy. Nibiru is a perfect example of the problem. In Mesopotamian material, Nibiru is a term with ancient astronomical and religious associations, and its interpretation depends on context. It does not straightforwardly function as Sitchin's hidden planet of the Anunnaki in the way his popular theory requires. The ancient evidence does not clearly describe a rogue world carrying extraterrestrial beings into Earth's neighborhood on a regular orbital schedule. That idea belongs to the modern reconstruction, not to an established reading of the tablets. This distinction is essential. The question is not whether the word Nibiru appears in ancient sources. The question is what it means there. A name appearing in a text is not a blank check. Ancient vocabulary cannot be removed from its setting and made to perform a modern role simply because the result is dramatic. To read responsibly, we have to ask how the word was used, what other texts say, what kind of document we are reading, and whether the proposed interpretation fits the broader evidence. Sitchin's version depends on making the ancient record much more literal, unified, and technologically explicit than it actually is. That is why scholars object. Not because the story is too strange. Ancient literature is already strange. They object because the method does not hold. There is another problem as well. Sitchin's theory tends to flatten Mesopotamian religion into a single secret history. The gods become aliens. Myths become reports. Ritual becomes memory of contact. Symbolic language becomes technological description. This may create a clean, modern narrative, but it strips away the ancient system's own logic. The divine hierarchy, temple economy, underworld judgment, kingship ideology, creation theology, and astral divination that gave the Anunnaki their original meaning. In trying to make the Anunnaki real, Sitchin made them less Mesopotamian. That is the irony. He helped millions of people hear their name, but often outside the world that made the name meaningful. The Anunnaki became famous as visitors from Nibiru, not as divine powers in a civilization that imagined reality through councils, decrees, cities, temples, omens, labor, and death. Their ancient complexity was replaced by a modern mythology of intervention. And yet, it would be too easy to dismiss the appeal of Sitchin's work as simple gullibility. Something deeper was happening. For many readers, Sitchin offered a feeling that conventional history rarely provides: intimacy with a hidden origin. His theory suggested that humanity was not an accidental species struggling through mud, hunger, invention, and memory. We were part of a larger cosmic story. Our myths were not merely stories. Our religions were not merely beliefs. Our civilizations were not merely human achievements. Everything pointed back to contact. That is emotionally powerful. It gives history a secret author. It gives suffering a reason, even if the reason is disturbing. It makes the confusion of human origins feel like a cover story waiting to be pierced. And it gives the reader the rare pleasure of standing outside the crowd, seeing what others have missed. This is why the Nibiru theory survived even when experts rejected it. Expert rejection can correct information, but it does not automatically answer emotional need. People are drawn to hidden history theories because they satisfy more than curiosity. They offer suspicion a home. They turn alienation into insight. They make the reader feel initiated. And initiation is one of the oldest human experiences. The form changed. The temple became the paperback. The priest became the alternative researcher. The secret name became Nibiru. Sitchin's influence also spread because his theory was adaptable. It could attach itself to other mysteries. Pyramids, megaliths, flood legends, ancient maps, missing civilizations, unexplained artifacts, sudden leaps in culture. Once the Anunnaki were imagined as advanced beings guiding or exploiting humanity, almost any ancient achievement could be folded into the same framework. That flexibility made the theory durable. It also made it slippery. When a theory can explain everything, it risks explaining nothing with precision. Real history is less obedient. It resists clean answers. The evidence from Mesopotamia does not line up into a single narrative of extraterrestrial colonization. It gives us religious literature, royal ideology, ritual texts, astronomical observations, myths of creation and flood, lists of gods, political theology, and underworld stories. These sources are extraordinary, but they do not clearly say what Sitchin needed them to say. They do not give us spacecraft. They do not give us genetic laboratories. They do not give us an accepted ancient account of beings from a planet called Nibiru engineering Homo sapiens. What they give us is older and more difficult. A record of how one of the world's earliest civilizations imagined the relationship between humanity and power. That may not satisfy everyone. It does not produce the same electric thrill as a hidden planet. It does not turn every tablet into evidence of a cosmic cover-up. It asks more patience from the viewer, and patience is not always the strongest force on the internet. But it has one advantage. It belongs to the evidence. The responsible way to approach Sitchin, then, is neither to sneer nor to surrender. His cultural impact is real. His role in popularizing the Anunnaki as extraterrestrials is undeniable. He shaped a huge part of modern alternative history. For many people, he was the doorway into Mesopotamian myth, even if the room he led them into was furnished with modern speculation. But when we step back through that doorway and return to the tablets themselves, the picture changes. The Anunnaki are not waiting there as astronauts in disguise. They are part of a sacred order. They belong to divine ancestry, cosmic rank, underworld judgment, creation, kingship, and the living sky. Their world is not technological in the way Sitchin imagined. It is theological, political, ritual, and symbolic. And that is not a downgrade. It is the actual terrain. Sitchin gave the modern Anunnaki a planet. Ancient Mesopotamia gave them a universe. And those are not the same thing. The question now is why the planetary version became so hard to kill. Why, after scholarly objections, after corrections, after repeated explanations of the ancient material, did the alien Anunnaki continue to thrive? The answer has less to do with Sumerian grammar than with modern psychology, because some theories survive not because they are well supported, but because they speak to a wound. They tell people that official history is incomplete, that the world is older and stranger than they were taught, that human beings may have a hidden origin, and that somewhere in the oldest stories, beneath the language of gods, a secret has been waiting for those bold enough to distrust the ordinary explanation. A theory does not need to be true to survive. It needs to feel necessary. That is the uncomfortable reason the Anunnaki alien story kept growing after Sitchin. Corrections were made. Scholars objected. Better translations were available. The ancient context was explained again and again, and still, the idea continued to spread through books, television, internet forums, documentaries, podcasts, comment sections, and the long, strange corridors of late-night curiosity. Because the theory was never only about Mesopotamia, it was about trust. Or more precisely, the loss of it. Modern people live surrounded by information, but not always by confidence. We are told that experts understand the past, that museums preserve it, that universities interpret it, that governments disclose what matters, that history books give us the basic shape of what happened. Yet the 20th and 21st centuries have given people many reasons to doubt official voices. Wars were justified with bad information. Institutions concealed scandals. Scientific knowledge changed. Governments kept secrets. Corporations manipulated truth. Archives opened and revealed that the public had not always been told the whole story. So when someone says they are hiding the real history of humanity, the claim does not land in an empty room. It lands in a culture already trained to suspect locked doors. The Anunnaki theory thrives in that atmosphere. It offers a past that feels suppressed. It suggests that the oldest texts contain truths scholars refuse to admit. It turns academic caution into evidence of fear. If a specialist says, the translation does not support that, the believer may hear, the gatekeepers are protecting the official story. If a museum label says, this is a religious object, the believer may wonder whether it is actually technological. If an ancient myth is symbolic, perhaps symbolism is just what later interpreters called knowledge they could not explain. Suspicion becomes a method. And once suspicion becomes a method, almost anything can look like evidence. This does not mean every person interested in the theory is paranoid. Many are simply drawn to mystery. They sense, correctly, that the ancient world is deeper than the simplified version they were given in school. They encounter Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, cuneiform tablets, flood myths, star omens, temple towers, and gods with unfamiliar names. And they feel the shock of realizing that human civilization is far older and stranger than modern life usually allows us to remember. That shock is valuable. It should not be mocked. The problem begins when wonder is forced to choose between two bad options. Either the ancient world was dull and primitive, or aliens must have helped. That is a false choice. The ancient world was not dull. It was not primitive in the lazy, dismissive sense. It was brilliant, violent, organized, anxious, poetic, ambitious, and capable of building systems of thought that still challenge us. But the alien theory offers a shortcut to awe. Instead of learning how Mesopotamian scribes thought, how temple economies worked, how kingship was justified, how omens were read, how myths changed across languages and centuries, the theory says, The answer is hidden contact. One key unlocks every door. One plot explains every symbol. That is easier than history. It is also more emotionally satisfying, because the alien Anunnaki story gives humanity a secret origin. It says we are not merely the result of evolution, migration, adaptation, agriculture, violence, invention, disease, memory, and chance. We are part of someone's plan. Even if that plan is exploitative, even if the Anunnaki are imagined as cold engineers or cosmic landlords, the story still gives us a strange kind of importance. We were made. We were noticed. We mattered enough for beings from the stars to intervene. That is not a small emotional reward. In a modern universe that often feels indifferent, the idea of ancient visitors can feel almost comforting, even when the visitors are not kind. At least someone came. At least the sky was not empty. At least the human story has a hidden author. This is where the old gods and the modern aliens quietly overlap. Both answer loneliness. The Mesopotamians looked upward and imagined a heaven full of authority, signs, and divine presence. Modern ancient astronaut theories look upward and imagine civilizations, spacecraft, and biological designers. The language changes. The need remains recognizable. Human beings do not like living under an empty sky. We would rather believe the powers above us are frightening than believe there are no powers there at all. Fear can be easier than silence. The Anunnaki theory also survives because it attaches itself to real achievements that deserve admiration. Mesopotamia really did produce some of the earliest cities. It really did preserve astonishing myths. It really did develop complex systems of writing, administration, astronomy, law, and royal ideology. These accomplishments are so impressive that they create an opening for disbelief. Some modern viewers look at them and think, how could people so long ago have done this? But that question often reveals more about modern arrogance than ancient limitation. People in the past were not intellectually weaker than us. They had fewer machines, but not smaller minds. They had different tools, different pressures, different institutions, and, in some cases, far more time devoted to problems we no longer think about in the same way. A society that watches the sky for centuries will know things that surprise a society that barely looks up from its screens long enough to identify the moon with confidence. Ancient knowledge can be impressive without being alien. Human coordination can be astonishing without being impossible. And suffering labor, however grim, can build monuments that later ages mistake for miracles. The appeal of the alien theory often comes from underestimating what organized human beings can do when religion, power, fear, surplus, skill, and time are all pointed in the same direction. A ziggurat does not require a spacecraft. It requires belief, administration, labor, materials, and a society willing or compelled to build upward for the gods. That is already a serious story. In some ways, it is more serious than the alien version, because it forces us to look at the human systems behind sacred architecture. But the alien story is cleaner. It removes the discomfort of human exploitation, political hierarchy, and religious obligation, replacing them with external intervention. If ancient people built something astonishing, perhaps they had help. If myths are strange, perhaps they are reports. If civilization emerged with startling speed, perhaps someone accelerated it. The theory turns complex human development into a dramatic encounter, and dramatic encounters are easier to sell. Television understood this. The internet amplified it. A careful explanation of Mesopotamian divine terminology has to work hard for attention. A claim that star beings genetically engineered humanity does not. It arrives already dressed for the stage. There is also the pleasure of forbidden knowledge. To believe in the alien Anunnaki is not only to believe a claim about the past, it is to occupy a position in the present. The believer becomes someone who sees through the veil, someone who is not fooled by official history, someone who belongs, however loosely, to a community of the awakened. That identity can be powerful, especially for people who feel ignored, patronized, or alienated by mainstream institutions. In that sense, the theory functions almost like a modern mystery religion. There is an outer teaching, the history taught in schools, then an inner teaching, the hidden truth of the gods from the stars. There are texts to decode, symbols to reinterpret, names to learn, enemies to distrust, and initiates who feel they have crossed from blindness into sight. This structure is ancient, even if the content is modern. Human beings have always been drawn to the idea that reality has a surface for the many and a secret depth for the few. The Anunnaki theory gives that old desire a cosmic setting. It also survives because it is flexible enough to absorb contradiction. When a predicted catastrophe involving Nibiru does not occur, the date can shift, or the meaning can be reinterpreted. When a translation is challenged, the challenger can be accused of bias. When ancient texts fail to mention spacecraft clearly, the language can be described as metaphor used by people who lacked technical vocabulary. When the evidence is absent, absence can become concealment. This is not how historical method works, but it is how resilient belief systems often work. A strong historical argument becomes stronger when it risks being wrong. It exposes itself to correction. It allows evidence to limit it. A theory that cannot be limited by evidence may feel invincible, but that invincibility is a warning sign. If every objection is proof of the theory, then the theory has stopped behaving like inquiry and started behaving like armor. The real tragedy is that this armor blocks a more interesting encounter with the ancient world, because the historical Anunnaki do not need rescuing by aliens. They are already powerful. They reveal a civilization that imagined creation as labor, death as judgment, kingship as heavenly descent, and the sky as a living field of signs. They show us that the first cities did not merely invent administration on Earth. They projected administration into the cosmos. They did not imagine a universe of comforting simplicity. They imagined one full of rank, pressure, decree, service, fear, negotiation, and occasional mercy. That is not an inferior mystery. It is a more human one. And perhaps that is why it is harder to face. Aliens allow us to keep the mystery outside ourselves. They make the strange thing come from elsewhere. But the Mesopotamian gods come from within human civilization's earliest attempt to understand power. They reflect the anxieties of cities, the burdens of labor, the instability of kingship, the terror of death, the need to read signs, and the hope that wisdom might intervene when authority becomes destructive. The real Anunnaki are not proof that humans met extraterrestrials. They are proof that humans, from very early on, felt governed by forces too large to confront directly. that feeling has not disappeared. We may no longer speak of Enlil's decrees or underworld judges in daily life, but we still live under systems we did not personally design. Governments, markets, algorithms, climates, institutions, histories, inherited debts, technologies, and invisible decisions made far above our ordinary reach. We still wonder who is really in control. We still suspect that power has rooms we cannot enter. We still look for hidden authors behind the visible world. In that sense, the Anunnaki alien theory survived because it modernized an ancient anxiety. It gave a face to the feeling that humanity is managed from somewhere else. Only now, the divine council becomes an alien hierarchy. The heavenly decree becomes a secret agenda. The creation of humans for labor becomes genetic engineering. The old structure remains, but the costumes change. That is why dismissing the theory too quickly misses something important. Historically, the evidence for extraterrestrial Anunnaki is not convincing, but psychologically, the theory is revealing. It tells us what modern people fear and desire. We fear that official stories are incomplete. We desire a hidden origin. We fear being manipulated. We desire to be special. We fear the sky is empty. We desire someone to be there. The theory survives because it speaks to all of these at once. It is not sustained by tablets alone. It is sustained by longing, and longing is harder to correct than a mistranslation. So when we return to the ancient sources, we should not do so with mockery, but with discipline. The task is not to crush wonder. It is to protect wonder from becoming lazy. Real wonder does not need to invent evidence. It can stand before damaged clay, uncertain words, and distant gods, and admit that the past is difficult enough on its own. The Anunnaki endured because they stand at the boundary between the known and the imagined. They are old enough to feel almost unreachable, complex enough to resist simple explanation, and strange enough that every age remakes them in its own image. Mesopotamia made them gods of order, rank, judgment, and cosmic power. The modern world made them visitors, engineers, and hidden rulers from the stars. Both versions tell us something, but only one belongs to the tablets. And to hear that older voice again, we have to set aside the machinery for a moment and ask the most basic question with fresh patience. When the scribes wrote of the Anunnaki, what did their texts actually say? And just as importantly, what did they not say? The first discipline of ancient history is learning to let the text disappoint you. Not because the text is dull, because it rarely says exactly what the modern imagination wants it to say. When people come to the Anunnaki through ancient astronaut theories, they often approach the tablets with a kind of hunger. They are looking for a line that finally breaks the case open. A description of vehicles, engines, planets, laboratories, star maps, genetic procedures, landing sites, or a hidden account of non-human visitors shaping early civilization. But the Mesopotamian texts do not speak in that way. They speak of gods, they speak of temples, they speak of offerings, kingship, creation, flood, underworld judgment, divine councils, fate, ritual, and signs in the heavens. They speak in the language of a civilization where religion was not separate from politics, where the sky was not separate from meaning, and where myth was not separate from the daily pressure of keeping a city alive. This does not make the texts simple. It makes them harder, because once we stop forcing them to confirm a modern theory, we have to meet them on their own ground. And that ground is not a runway for spacecraft. It is a world of clay tablets, temple households, royal inscriptions, scribal schools, lamentations, hymns, and stories copied across generations by people who understood gods as real powers woven into the structure of existence. The Anunnaki appear in that world as divine beings of rank and authority. But they do not appear in one clean, uniform way across all periods. Sometimes they are associated with the high gods and the ordering of destiny. Sometimes they appear in the darker setting of the underworld, as judges of the dead. Sometimes the term overlaps with broader divine groupings. Sometimes later traditions shift the emphasis. The name carries weight, but not a single fixed modern identity. That is already one important correction. The ancient record does not give us the Anunnaki as a species with a technical mission. It gives us a religious category whose meaning changes with context. And context is where most of the modern distortion happens. Take creation. Mesopotamian myths can describe humanity as fashioned from clay and divine substance, created to relieve the gods of labor. That image is disturbing, powerful, and strange. But in its ancient setting, it speaks directly to the world that produced it. A world of irrigation work, temple service, agricultural burden, and sacred hierarchy. Human beings are made to serve because service was central to how Mesopotamian society understood humanity's place in the cosmos. A speculative reading changes the frame. Clay becomes biology. Divine substance becomes DNA. Labor becomes mining. Creation becomes engineering. But the text itself does not clearly give us a laboratory. It gives us a myth about work. And that myth is not less meaningful because it is not modern science in disguise. In fact, it may be more revealing. It tells us that one of the earliest urban civilizations looked at human existence and saw labor as fundamental. Not accidental, not temporary. Fundamental. Humans were creatures who carried burdens, maintained order, fed gods, worked fields, built cities, and performed rituals. That is the world the creation myth explains. Or take the flood. The Mesopotamian flood traditions are among the most haunting texts of the ancient Near East. They speak of divine conflict, human vulnerability, warning, survival, and the terrifying possibility that the gods might decide humanity has become too numerous, too loud, too disruptive. The gods are not always unified. Wisdom intervenes. A human survivor is saved. The waters recede, but the relationship between humans and gods remains tense. A speculative reading can turn the flood into a technological event, an operation, perhaps a managed disaster or a memory of planetary catastrophe. But again, the texts do not clearly give us spacecraft or advanced machines. They give us divine decision-making. They give us water as cosmic threat. They give us survival through warning and obedience. They give us a civilization shaped by rivers imagining destruction through the very force that made life possible. That is not a small thing. Then there is kingship. The Sumerian king list and related traditions speak of kingship descending from heaven. This phrase has become one of the favorite doorways into modern reinterpretation. To some, it sounds like proof that political authority was physically delivered from the sky by beings who came from elsewhere. But in the Mesopotamian context, kingship from heaven means something different and in its own way, more serious. It means that kingship was sacred. It means political order was imagined as having a source beyond ordinary human ambition. It means a throne required divine legitimacy. It means cities could rise and fall as kingship moved under the approval or withdrawal of higher powers. The ancient claim is not about transportation, it is about authority. And authority mattered because the Mesopotamian city was never merely a place where people happened to live. It was a sacred and political organism, dependent on gods, kings, temples, canals, scribes, laborers, soldiers, and harvests. To say kingship descended from heaven was to place power inside the cosmic order. It made rule meaningful. It made rule dangerous. It made failure interpretable. Again, the ancient meaning is not weaker than the modern one. It is simply not the same. The same caution applies to the stars. Mesopotamian religion and astronomy were deeply connected. Gods were associated with celestial bodies. Omens were read in the sky. Calendars depended on heavenly rhythms. Kings cared about eclipses and planetary appearances because heaven was understood as a realm of signs. But the texts do not clearly say that the Anunnaki arrived in ships from distant worlds. The sky was divine before it was outer space. That is difficult for modern people to hold in mind because we inherit a post-telescope sky. We know the planets are physical bodies. We know the stars are suns. We know the moon is a world. We know that up there can be approached by rockets and mathematics. So when an ancient text speaks of heaven, we instinctively pull it toward our own sky. But ancient heaven was not only altitude, it was order. It was command. It was the realm from which meaning, fate, and legitimacy descended. To translate that directly into outer space is not a discovery. It is a cultural substitution. This is why the actual texts are so important. They resist our impatience. They force us to ask not only whether a phrase can be made to sound modern, but what it meant inside the system that produced it. A god may come down. A deity may be linked with a star. A council may decide fate. Humans may be made from clay. None of these details automatically becomes evidence of extraterrestrial contact unless we first remove them from their religious, literary, and social setting. And once we remove them, we are no longer reading Mesopotamia. We are reading ourselves. The real archive is fragmentary, but not silent. It shows us that Mesopotamians imagined a universe crowded with divine agency. The gods could be majestic, petty, wise, terrifying, generous, remote, or dangerously close. They lived in divine households, held councils, received offerings, assigned destinies, controlled natural forces, and shaped political life. They could disagree. They could regret. They could be served. They could be feared. This is not the language of a technical manual. It is the language of mythic civilization. And mythic civilization is not a synonym for ignorance. That assumption has done enormous damage to the way people read ancient texts. Myth is not what people create when they are too stupid to do science. Myth is what people create when they are trying to place human life inside a meaningful order before the modern categories have been separated. It can preserve memory, encode social structure, dramatize psychological truth, justify power, resist power, explain ritual, and give shape to fear. The Anunnaki belong to that kind of language. They are part of a symbolic and religious system, but symbolic does not mean unreal to the people who used it. A symbol can be one of the strongest realities in a society. A crown is symbolic, but people die for crowns. A flag is symbolic, but nations organize themselves around it. A temple image is symbolic to a modern museum visitor, but in its original setting, it could be treated as the seat of divine presence. The ancient world was not confused because its realities were different from ours. It was organized around meanings we no longer automatically share. So when we ask what the texts actually say, the answer is both clear and unsatisfying to those looking for aliens. They say the Anunnaki were divine powers. They say Mesopotamians imagined the cosmos as layered and governed. They say humanity was created in relation to divine labor and service. They say kingship had heavenly legitimacy. They say the dead could face judgment in the underworld. They say the heavens were full of signs. They do not clearly say that extraterrestrial beings came to Earth in machines from a planet called Nibiru to genetically engineer the human species. That sentence is the modern overlay, not the ancient record. The distinction matters because without it, we lose the very thing that makes the Anunnaki historically valuable. If we turn them into aliens too quickly, they become evidence for a theory. But if we let them remain gods, they become evidence for something broader and more profound. The way early civilization imagined power itself. They show us how people living in the first cities understood dependence. Dependence on water, dependence on harvest, dependence on kings, dependence on temples, dependence on divine favor, dependence on signs, dependence on decisions made far above the ordinary person's reach. The Anunnaki make sense in that world because they are not simply beings. They are authorities. They belong to a cosmos where fate can be decreed, labor can be assigned, death can be judged, and kingship can descend. That vision may feel alien to us, but not because it comes from outer space. It feels alien because it comes from a human world so old that its assumptions no longer feel natural. And perhaps that is why the alien theory became so tempting. It is easier to imagine beings from another planet than to enter the mind of a civilization that did not separate religion, politics, astronomy, economy, and myth the way we do. Outer space feels familiar to us now. Ancient thought, honestly encountered, can feel far stranger. We know what a spaceship is. We do not always know what to do with a universe where the gods require breakfast, or where a king's legitimacy depends on omens, or where humanity is made to relieve divine labor, or where the underworld has judges, or where the sky is not empty distance but a living system of warnings and order. That older world asks more of us as viewers. It asks us to slow down, to resist the clean answer, to accept that damaged tablets do not exist to satisfy modern suspense, to understand that a myth can be more than false fact and less than literal history. It can be a civilization thinking in sacred images. The real question, then, is not whether the texts are mysterious. They are. The question is whether we are willing to let the mystery be ancient. Because the Anunnaki do not need spaceships to unsettle us. Their power lies in the way they reveal an early human conviction that existence is governed from beyond the visible edge of ordinary life. A conviction that our work, our rulers, our deaths, our disasters, and even the stars above us belong to a structure we did not create. That is what the texts actually preserve, not a hidden science fiction plot, a sacred architecture of power. And once we see that, the mystery shifts. We no longer have to ask only whether the Anunnaki were aliens. We can ask a deeper question. Why did the first urban civilizations need gods like this at all? Why did they imagine the universe as ruled by distant, powerful, sometimes terrifying intelligences? Why did civilization, almost from the beginning, look upward and picture authority looking back? That is where the real mystery begins to breathe. Maybe the real mystery was never whether beings came down from the stars. Maybe the real mystery is why the first cities imagined power that way at all. Why, at the very beginning of recorded urban life, do we find human beings describing the universe as if it were ruled by distant authorities? Why do the gods sit in councils? Why do they assign destinies? Why does kingship come from above? Why is death imagined as a court? Why is human labor explained as service to powers greater than ourselves? These questions are quieter than the alien question. They are also harder to escape because they do not let us keep the strangeness safely outside the human story. They bring it back into the city, into the canal, into the palace, into the temple storeroom, into the hand of the scribe pressing signs into wet clay. They ask us to look at civilization itself and notice how early it produced not only walls, grain accounts, and kings, but also a vision of the cosmos as hierarchy. The Anunnaki are disturbing because they appear at the meeting point between religion and administration. That may sound like a strange place for mystery to live, but it is exactly where Mesopotamia puts it. These gods are not simply wild spirits of mountain and storm. They belong to a world of ranks, offices, decrees, and judgments. They are part of a sacred order that resembles, in magnified form, the new human order of cities. And that resemblance is not accidental. When human beings began to live in large, organized settlements, they entered a new kind of life. The village world did not vanish, but the city changed the scale of everything. More people, more labor, more food storage, more conflict, more inequality, more records, more dependence on systems no one person could fully see. The city created power at a distance. A decision made in a palace or temple could shape the day of someone who would never meet the decision maker. Once power becomes distant, it becomes easier to imagine the universe itself as ruled from a distance. The farmer does not see the whole irrigation system, but his field depends on it. The laborer does not sit in the council, but his body answers to its commands. The king may never touch the clay tablet that records a ration, but his authority moves through scribes, overseers, seals, and storehouses. Civilization teaches people that invisible arrangements can control visible life. The Anunnaki are one sacred expression of that lesson. They are not mysterious because they are random. They are mysterious because they make cosmic what the city made social. A person in Mesopotamia lived beneath layers of authority: household, temple, palace, city god, great gods, fate, death. The visible world already felt structured by powers above and beyond the individual. Myth extended that structure into the heavens and beneath the earth. It imagined that the pressures of human life were not merely local accidents. They belonged to the architecture of reality. This is why the question, were they aliens, can become too small. It asks whether the gods were really a different kind of being. The older material asks why humans imagined being itself as organized through command. That is a deeper and darker question. It suggests that the first great civilizations did not simply celebrate order. They feared it. They needed it. They suffered under it. They saw that order could feed a city, but also conscript a worker. It could protect a wall, but also justify a throne. It could turn water into agriculture, but also turn human life into obligation. Order was salvation and burden at the same time. The Anunnaki carry that double meaning. They are powers of structure. They give destiny, but destiny can feel like a sentence. They support kingship, but kingship can become domination. They help explain creation, but creation makes humanity a servant. They judge the dead, but judgment offers no easy comfort. They belong to the heavens, but heaven's not gentle simply because it is high. This is not a universe designed to reassure modern viewers. It does not say human beings are free masters of their own fate. It does not say power is accountable in the ways we might want. It says existence is layered, ranked, and governed, that human life has meaning because it has a place, and that place is not at the top. There is humility in that. There is also fear, and both are part of the real mystery. When later generations turned the Anunnaki into extraterrestrials, they changed the costume but kept the anxiety. The alien version still imagines humanity shaped by powers above us. It still imagines a hidden origin. It still imagines rulers or engineers operating from outside ordinary awareness. It still asks whether human civilization was guided, controlled, or manipulated by intelligences we barely understand. In that sense, the modern theory is not a complete break from the ancient myth. It is a technological translation of an older human feeling, the feeling that our lives are not entirely our own. The difference is that Mesopotamian religion placed that feeling inside a sacred cosmos. Modern speculation places it inside a scientific-looking universe of planets, genes, resources, and secret history. But the emotional structure remains recognizable. We look upward, we sense power, and we wonder whether the story we have been told about ourselves is incomplete. That is why the Anunnaki are so difficult to leave alone. They sit at the edge of several great human anxieties. The anxiety of origin. Who made us and why? The anxiety of labor. Why must life be so heavy with work? The anxiety of rule. Who has the right to command? The anxiety of death. What happens when our status is stripped away? The anxiety of the sky. Is there meaning above us, or only distance? Mesopotamia answered these anxieties with gods. The modern world often answers them with aliens, simulations, hidden elites, lost civilizations, or impersonal systems. We change the vocabulary, but we keep asking versions of the same questions. Somewhere above the ordinary human level, we imagine decision-makers. Somewhere behind the visible world, we suspect design. Somewhere in the past, we hope there is an explanation that would make the present make sense. This does not prove the Anunnaki were real in the way ancient astronaut theories claim. It proves they are real in another way. They are real as evidence of the human mind confronting civilization. They show us what power looked like when cities were young, and the world still had to be explained through sacred relationships. They show us that early people did not merely ask how crops grew or why storms came. They asked why society itself had the shape it did, why some ruled and others served, why humans worked for gods, why the dead entered a lower court, why the sky seemed full of signs, why destiny felt assigned rather than chosen. These are not primitive questions. They are permanent ones. We are still asking them, only with different instruments. Today, we may speak of economics instead of divine labor. We may speak of political legitimacy instead of kingship from heaven. We may speak of surveillance, algorithms, institutions, and climate systems instead of omens and decrees. We may no longer imagine the Anunnaki seated in a divine council, but many people still feel that their lives are shaped by remote powers they cannot see, appeal to, or understand. That continuity should make us pause. Maybe the Anunnaki endure because they name a condition that has never fully left us, the condition of living under systems larger than the self. For Mesopotamians, those systems were divine. For us, they may be technological, political, economic, ecological, or cosmic, but the emotional posture is familiar. We stand in the middle, not at the summit. We inherit a world already structured. We are born into rules, languages, debts, borders, calendars, myths, and hierarchies we did not choose. We work, we age, we look for signs. We tell stories about the powers behind things. That is the human position the Anunnaki make visible. And perhaps this is why the ancient texts feel so much stranger when read carefully than when forced into a modern conspiracy. The alien theory gives us a villain, or at least a suspect. It turns the mystery into an investigation of outside beings. But the older myths hold up a mirror to the social and spiritual imagination of humanity itself. They suggest that the gods were not only up there, they were also made from the experience of being down here, under command, under sky, under time, under death. That does not make them fake in any simple sense. Myth is not just a decorative lie. Myth is a way cultures organize what feels most real, especially when ordinary language is not enough. The Anunnaki organized the reality of power. They gave faces and names to the immense pressures that shaped Mesopotamian life. The river, the king, the temple, the field, the grave, the heavens, the unexplained turn of fortune. To ask whether the Anunnaki were only myths is to underestimate what myths do. A myth can outlive an empire because it captures something an empire itself cannot control. The Akkadian and Babylonian kings are gone. The cities fell, rose, changed, vanished, were buried, excavated, and argued over. The scribal schools disappeared. The gods lost their temples. The languages had to be recovered by modern scholarship from broken clay. And still, the Anunnaki remain. Not with the same meaning, not in the same world, but as a name that continues to disturb the boundary between history and imagination. They survive because they are flexible enough to be misunderstood, powerful enough to be remembered, and ancient enough to feel like they might conceal something we have not yet learned. They do conceal something, but perhaps not a fleet of spacecraft. Perhaps they conceal the oldest political theology of the human city. The moment when people began to imagine that the systems governing their lives had counterparts in the structure of the universe. The moment when power became cosmic. The moment when the sky was not merely above the city, but responsible for it. That is an extraordinary inheritance. And it leads us to a humbler conclusion than the loud theories usually allow. The real mystery of the Anunnaki is not that ancient people may have mistaken aliens for gods. It is that ancient people understood, with remarkable clarity, that human beings live beneath powers they cannot fully master. They gave those powers divine names. We give them other names now. But the feeling persists. Something governs. Something decides. Something remains above our reach. Whether that something is God, fate, nature, empire, history, or the indifferent vastness of space depends on the age asking the question. The Anunnaki are one of the earliest answers preserved in writing. And like all powerful answers, they reveal the question that made them necessary. Why are we here, under this sky, bound to work, ruled by others, moving toward death, searching for signs, and hoping that somewhere beyond the visible world there is meaning rather than emptiness? That is the real mystery. Not a secret hidden behind the tablets, a human wound pressed into clay. And so we return to the oldest gesture in the story, looking up, before telescopes, before rockets, before modern astronomy turned the night into a map of distances. The sky was already a place of meaning. It was the great ceiling above the first cities, the clock of ritual time, the field of omens, the home of gods, the place from which kingship could descend and fate could be imagined as spoken. For Mesopotamia, the sky was not empty, and perhaps that is the simplest reason the Anunnaki never quite disappeared. They belong to that ancient human instinct to look above the visible world and suspect that something more is there, not necessarily something gentle, not necessarily something waiting to rescue us. Sometimes the powers above are severe. Sometimes they are distant. Sometimes they judge, command, ignore, or demand service. But even a frightening heaven can feel less unbearable than a meaningless one. That may be the thread connecting the ancient myth to the modern fascination. The people of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria looked up and saw divine order. Later readers looked up and imagined visitors from the stars. The language changed from gods to extraterrestrials, from omens to evidence, from heaven to outer space. But the emotional movement remained. The human mind reaching upward, trying to understand whether our story begins and ends with ourselves. The Anunnaki endure because they stand precisely at that boundary. They are ancient enough to feel like a message from the beginning of civilization, strange enough to attract speculation, flexible enough to be reshaped by every age that encounters them. To the Mesopotamians, they belonged to a sacred hierarchy of cosmic powers. To modern alternative history, they became engineers from a hidden planet. To careful readers today, they are something more difficult and more valuable. A window into how the first urban societies imagined power, labor, death, kingship, and the sky. That does not solve the mystery in the way some people want it solved. There is no clean final tablet that says, "Here is the truth," and everyone can stop arguing now. Ancient history almost never gives us that luxury. The record is broken, the language shifts, the gods change roles across centuries. The same name can carry different shades of meaning in different settings. The evidence asks for patience, and patience is not always popular where mystery is concerned. But some things can be said honestly. The Mesopotamian texts do not clearly describe the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial astronauts. They do not give us an accepted ancient account of spacecraft, alien genetics, or a race of beings arriving from Nibiru to engineer humankind. Those ideas belong to modern reinterpretation, especially the 20th century tradition of ancient astronaut speculation. What the texts do give us is no less extraordinary. They give us gods who rule and judge, gods who belong to heaven and the underworld, gods connected to creation, destiny, kingship, ritual, and the terrifying order of death. They give us a civilization that imagined humanity as necessary but not central, sacred but subordinate, made of earth, touched by divinity, and bound to serve powers beyond itself. And in that vision, we can hear something older than conspiracy. We can hear the pressure of the first cities thinking about themselves. A city is never only walls and streets. It is obedience, work, memory, hunger, fear, rank, law, storage, violence, ritual, and hope arranged into a livable form. Mesopotamia took that experience and projected it across the universe. Heaven became a court. The underworld became a court. The gods became rulers, judges, patrons, and administrators of reality itself. That is the real secret history of the Anunnaki. Not that they reveal a hidden species from the stars, but that they reveal how early human beings understood the feeling of living beneath power. And that feeling has not left us. We still live under forces larger than ourselves. We still inherit systems we did not design. We still wonder who benefits from the order around us. We still fear decisions made far away. We still search the sky for meaning, even if now we call that search science, philosophy, religion, or speculation. We still ask whether humanity is alone, whether our origins hide a deeper truth, whether the universe is indifferent or aware. The Anunnaki survive because they touch all of these questions at once. They are gods, symbols, memories, misunderstandings, and mirrors, depending on who is looking. They stand in the space between evidence and imagination, which is exactly where human beings have always built their most persistent stories. So perhaps the answer is not to choose between wonder and caution. We need both. Caution keeps us from turning every ancient metaphor into machinery. Wonder keeps us from reducing myth to dead words on broken clay. The Anunnaki deserve to be approached with both, with enough discipline to admit what the texts do not say, and enough imagination to feel the force of what they do. Because when those scribes pressed the names of gods into clay, they were not writing for us. They were writing from within a world where the sky was alive with order, where kings ruled by heavenly sanction, where death had judges, where creation explained labor, and where humanity stood beneath powers it could serve but never fully master. Thousands of years later, we read the fragments differently. We bring our rockets, our satellites, our doubts, our loneliness, our suspicion of institutions, our hunger or hidden origins. We bring ourselves, and in doing so, we sometimes mistake our reflection for the ancient world. But if we listen carefully, beneath all the modern noise, something older remains, a civilization looking upward, a human hand shaping wet clay, a name preserved long after its temples fell, Anunnaki. Whether seen as gods, symbols, or misunderstood memories, they reveal one of humanity's oldest fears and oldest hopes. That above us, beyond us, perhaps even within the structure of reality itself, there is an intelligence watching back. And maybe that is why the story still has power. Not because it proves we were visited, but because it reminds us that from the beginning, human beings have lived beneath the sky with the same quiet question. Are we alone here? Or has something always been looking down?